Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the patient, salt-stained world of distant lighthouses, famous explorers, and the long voyages that asked ordinary people to trust wooden ships, dim lamps, imperfect charts, and tiny brass instruments in very unreasonable oceans. So before we drift into reefs, fog banks, frozen decks, supply ledgers, lighthouse stairs, and navigators trying to make calm decisions under a sky with no visible horizon, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these late-night journeys through history. And if you feel like commenting, tell me what the weather is doing outside your window tonight, or which lighthouse, ship, or old voyage you would want us to visit next. I always like imagining people in different rooms, cities, coastlines, and quiet hours gathering here to relax while learning about the long, strange history of seafaring. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let the sea take its time. The lantern room of the Bell Rock Lighthouse sits 115 feet above the North Sea, a solitary chamber of glass and bronze where the air remains perpetually scented with the clean, sharp aroma of colza oil and the faint, metallic tang of polished reflectors. To understand the patient history of the sea, one must begin with the stillness of the watch, a quietude that has defined the maritime experience for centuries, measured not in moments of crisis, but in the slow rotation of the light and the steady recording of the ledger. It is the year 1811, and the first entries in the keeper's log are being written with a quill that scratches softly against the heavy rag paper, documenting the height of the tide against the Arbroath sandstone and the precise consumption of oil in the lamps. Here, the ocean is not a character, but a vast, rhythmic architecture, a sequence of swells and currents that have been charted by generations of hydrographers whose names, Vancouver, Cook, Flinders, are etched into the margins of the world's maps. This is the first segment of our journey into the archives of the deep, a meditation on the permanence of the horizon and the meticulous care required to navigate it. The history of the lighthouse is, at its core, a history of light and shadow, and of the men who dedicated their lives to the preservation of a singular, unblinking flame. Before the advent of the great Fresnel lenses, the illumination of the coast was a matter of sheer physical labor and the constant maintenance of silvered copper reflectors. At the Eddystone or the Skerryvore, the keepers followed a routine that had remained unchanged since the late 18th century, a cycle of trimming wicks and cleaning soot from the glass panes that stood between the light and the freezing spray of the Atlantic. The journals of these stations are filled with the minutiae of existence, the arrival of the supply tender with barrels of flour and salted beef, the repair of a cracked pane after a winter gale, and the sightings of passing vessels, brigantines, schooners, and East Indiamen, whose sails appeared as ghost-white flecks against the grey expanse of the morning. There is a profound stillness in these records, a sense of time stretching out toward the horizon, where the only urgency is the rising of the sun and the setting of the watch. To consider the voyages of the great explorers is to consider the slow, deliberate movement of timber through water. When the HMS Resolution set sail under James Cook in 1772, it carried with it the weight of an entire Enlightenment philosophy, an ambition to map the unknown not for conquest, but for the sake of precise measurement. The ship was a floating laboratory, its holds packed with chronometers by Larcom Kendall and John Arnold, instruments of delicate brass and steel that required constant winding and the most stable of environments to keep the time of Greenwich against the shifting tides of the Pacific. The logs of the Resolution are masterpieces of dry, archival detail, noting the temperature of the water at noon, the salinity of the spray, and the exact botanical characteristics of the kelp found drifting near the Antarctic Circle. There is no drama in these entries, only the steady accumulation of data, the quiet satisfaction of a coordinate accurately plotted and a coastline rendered in ink upon a vellum chart. The provisioning of such a vessel was a feat of logistical patience that spanned months of preparation in the dockyards of Deptford and Plymouth. One can almost smell the scent of the dry stores, the heavy, earthy aroma of thousands of pounds of ship's biscuit, the sharp brine of the pork barrels, and the bitter, medicinal scent of the malt and sauerkraut carried to ward off the scurvy. The quartermasters moved through the lower decks with lanterns, checking the lashings on the water casks and ensuring that the spare sails were kept dry in their canvas wrappings. Life on board was a series of repetitive motions, the holestoning of the decks at dawn, the hauling of the braces, and the slow, rhythmic creaking of the hull as it adjusted to the swell. It was a world governed by the glass, the half-hour sand timer that dictated the rhythm of the watches and the sounding of the bell, a sound that carried across the water like a heartbeat, marking the passage of time in a place where the landmarks were few and the stars were many. In the archives of the Hydrographic Office, there are charts that date back to the early 19th century, hand-colored maps where the depths are recorded in fathoms and the coastline is a delicate tracing of pen and wash. These maps are the result of thousands of hours of sounding, the lead line dropped into the cold water again and again, the sailor feeling for the vibration of the lead hitting the seabed, noting whether the bottom was sand, shell, ooze, or rock. This was the work of the surveyors, men who spent years in small boats under the lee of remote islands, measuring angles with their sextants and calculating the rise and fall of the tide against a marked pole. Their notes are a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, a quiet chronicle of patience in the face of the immense and the indifferent. They recorded the positions of hidden reefs and the set of the current with a precision that remains relevant to this day, their work forming the foundation upon which all subsequent navigation was built. Consider the lighthouse at Cape Otway, standing on the rugged southern coast of Australia, where the Southern Ocean meets the Bay Strait. Built in 1848, it was the first sight of land for thousands of emigrants who had spent 3 months at sea, their lives compressed into the narrow confines of a wooden hull. The light here was a beacon of arrival, a steady pulse of white in the darkness that signaled the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The keepers at Otway lived in a world of wind and stone, their horizons defined by the migration of whales and the seasonal changes in the weather. Their reports to the Marine Board are filled with the details of the lamp's performance, how many gallons of oil were consumed during a particularly foggy week, the condition of the wick trimming scissors, and the arrival of the mail boat, which brought news of a world that seemed increasingly distant and abstract. The transition from sail to steam was a slow and measured progression, a gradual layering of new technology over the old traditions of the sea. The early steamships, like the Great Western or the Sirius, still carried masts and sails, their paddles churning the water in a rhythmic, mechanical cadence that contrasted with the silent grace of the wind-driven vessels. In the engine rooms, the heat was a physical presence, the smell of coal smoke and hot oil mingling with the salt air. The engineers were a new breed of mariner, their hands stained with grease rather than tar, their eyes fixed on pressure gauges and water levels rather than the set of the royals. Yet, the fundamental nature of the voyage remained unchanged, the sea still demanded the same respect, the same meticulous attention to detail, and the same slow, deliberate pace of life. The logs of the Arctic explorers, such as those of Sir John Franklin or William Edward Parry, provide a different kind of maritime chronicle, one of stillness and the white silence of the ice. Locked in the frozen grip of the North for years at a time, these ships became stationary outposts of Victorian society, their cabins filled with books, musical instruments, and the constant scratch of pens on paper. The men spent their days taking magnetic observations, recording the patterns of the aurora borealis, and maintaining the ship's hull against the immense pressure of the pack ice. There is a haunting quality to these records, a sense of time suspended in a landscape where the sun does not rise for months and the only sound is the groaning of the ice and the whistling of the wind through the frozen rigging. They lived in a world of white and blue, their focus narrowed to the immediate needs of survival and the preservation of their scientific data. Back in the warmer latitudes, the trade routes were the arteries of the globe, the paths etched by the tea clippers as they raced from Fuzhou to London, their hulls lean and sharp, designed for speed and the efficient transport of precious cargo. The Cutty Sark and the Thermopylae were the pinnacles of this era, vessels of exquisite craftsmanship where every rope and pulley was optimized for performance. The records of these voyages are filled with the details of the cargo, thousands of chests of bohea and Suchin tea, stowed with a precision that ensured the ship remained perfectly balanced. The captains of these vessels were masters of the wind, practitioners of an ancient art that required an intimate knowledge of the atmosphere and the ocean's currents. They watched the barometer with a steady gaze, noting the subtle shifts in pressure that heralded the arrival of the monsoon or the doldrums. The history of the sea is also the history of the materials that made these journeys possible. The oak and teak of the hulls, the hemp of the ropes, the canvas of the sails, and the copper sheathing that protected the timber from the ravages of the teredo worm. Each of these materials had its own story, its own journey from the forests of Europe or the plantations of the East to the shipyards where they were shaped by the hands of master shipwrights. The scent of a shipyard was a complex tapestry of sawdust, boiling pitch, and the sharp, clean smell of iron being forged. To walk through the archives of a historic dockyard is to encounter the blueprints and models of 1,000 ships, each one a testament to the ingenuity and labor of generations of craftsmen. As we move deeper into the night, the image of the lighthouse remains a constant, a symbol of the enduring human presence on the edge of the wild. Whether it is the distant flash of the Fastnet Rock or the steady glow of the Corduan in the Gironde estuary, these structures stand as monuments to the order and regularity of maritime life. The Fresnel lens, with its intricate arrangement of glass prisms, was a marvel of 19th-century engineering, capable of capturing the flickering light of an oil lamp and projecting it for miles across the darkened water. The maintenance of these lenses was a task of immense delicacy, requiring the keepers to wear soft linen gloves and to use only the finest chamois leather to ensure that not a single speck of dust or grease remained on the glass. The light was their charge, a sacred duty that linked them to every sailor on the horizon. The journals of the lighthouse service often reflect a deep sense of peace, a contentment found in the solitude and the repetitive nature of the work. One keeper, stationed at a remote light in the Hebrides, wrote of the infinite variety of the grey sea, noting how the light changed from the silver of dawn to the deep leaden hue of a winter afternoon. He recorded the return of the gannets in the spring and the sound of the wind in the gallery, a low, melodic hum that became the soundtrack to his life. There was a dignity in this isolation, a sense of being part of something much larger than oneself, a cosmic clockwork of tides and stars that continued regardless of the world's affairs. In the quiet hours of the middle watch, between midnight and 4 in the morning, the world of the mariner is at its most profound. On the bridge of a sailing ship, the only light comes from the binnacle, where the compass card floats in its bath of alcohol, its markings clear and steady. The helmsman feels the vibration of the rudder through the wheel, a subtle communication from the water that tells him how the ship is responding to the swell. High above, the sails are dark shapes against the stars, their canvas taut and humming with the energy of the wind. This is the timeless voyage, a journey that has been undertaken by countless souls across the centuries, each one contributing their own small line to the vast, unfolding history of the sea. The archival records of the great shipping lines, such as the Cunard or the Peninsular and Oriental, offer a glimpse into the transition toward the modern era, where the voyage became a matter of scheduled elegance. The ledgers of these companies are filled with the names of passengers, the menus of 10-course dinners, and the inventories of fine linens and silver plate. Yet, even in these palaces of the sea, the fundamental realities of maritime life remained. The captain still made his daily observations, the lookout still scanned the horizon for ice or other vessels, and the sound of the engines provided a constant, reassuring pulse that echoed the rhythm of the waves. The sea remained the ultimate arbiter, a vast and unpredictable force that required the same vigilance and care as it did in the days of the earliest explorers. As the light of the lighthouse continues its slow rotation, we are reminded of the continuity of history, the way in which the past is layered upon the present like the sediment on the ocean floor. The stories of the sea are not just stories of discovery and trade, but stories of patience, of work, and of the long, quiet hours of the watch. They are the chronicles of the distant lights that have guided us home, the explorers who have mapped the limits of our world, and the voyages that have connected us across the vastness of the deep. In the silence of the night, we can almost hear the creak of the timber, the splash of the lead line, and the steady scratching of the quill in the keeper's log, documenting the passage of time in a world that is forever defined by the horizon and the stars. The archival detail of a single voyage can fill volumes, from the manifest of the cargo to the daily weather reports and the records of the crew's health. In the late 19th century, the use of the telegraph began to link the world's ports, but the experience of being at sea remained one of profound disconnection from the land. A ship was its own world, a self-contained community governed by its own laws and traditions. The preservation of these records allow us to reconstruct that world in all its quiet complexity, to understand the texture of the canvas, the weight of the anchor, and the precise color of the sea under a midsummer sun. It is a history written in salt and ink, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of the infinite. The Maritime Sleep Chronicle is a journey into this stillness, a meditation on the slow and rhythmic nature of the sea. It is an invitation to leave behind the urgency of the modern world and to enter a space where time is measured by the tide and the rotation of the light. As we continue through these segments, we will explore the depths of the archives, the secrets of the old charts, and the lives of those who spent their days and nights on the edge of the world. We will listen to the sound of the surf against the base of the lighthouse and the wind in the rigging of a distant ship, finding in these sounds a sense of peace and a connection to the timeless history of the maritime world. In the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, there sits a mahogany box containing the instruments used by David Livingstone during his explorations. Among them is a sextant, its brass tarnished by years of exposure to the elements, yet its scales still perfectly legible. This instrument, like the chronometers of Cook and the lenses of the Stevenson family, is a bridge to the past, a tangible link to a time when the world was still being measured and understood. To hold such an object is to feel the weight of the history it represents, the cold mornings on the deck of a ship, the long nights spent calculating positions by the light of a candle, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing the world take shape upon a map. The history of the sea is also a history of the silence that exists between the notes of the bell. It is the silence of the fog that rolls in from the Atlantic, obscuring the world in a soft, white shroud and forcing the mariner to rely on his ears and his instincts. In the lighthouse, the foghorn would begin its rhythmic groan, a sound that carried for miles, warning away those who came too close to the rocks. Inside the lantern room, the keeper would continue his work, the light reflecting off the mist in a kaleidoscope of soft, diffused color. This was a time of heightened awareness, a time when the world seemed to contract to the immediate surroundings, and the only certainty was the steady pulse of the light and the slow passage of the hours. As the first segment of our chronicle draws to a close, we find ourselves back at the beginning, at the edge of the water where the land meets the sea. The tide is coming in, a slow and inexorable movement that has been repeated for millions of years. The lighthouse stands as a silent sentinel, its light a constant in an ever-changing world. The explorers have sailed beyond the horizon, their names recorded in the charts and the ledgers of history. The voyages continue, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of the maritime experience. We rest in the knowledge that this history is preserved, that the stories of the sea are held in the quiet archives of the world, waiting to be told in the stillness of the night. The archive is a place of deep quiet, where the air is still and the only sound is the turning of a page. Here, the maps of the past are laid out on long tables, their colors still vibrant, their lines still crisp. One can trace the route of the HMS Beagle as it navigated the intricate channels of Tierra del Fuego, or follow the path of the tea clippers across the Indian Ocean. Every mark on these maps represents a moment of observation, a fragment of the world that was captured and recorded for posterity. They are the artifacts of a slow and deliberate process of discovery, a process that required not just courage, but a profound and lasting patience. The lighthouse keeper's log for the Bell Rock, dated the 12th of October, 1815, records a day of light winds and clear skies. The oil consumption was normal, the wicks were trimmed at the usual intervals, and a single whale was sighted to the northeast. There is nothing in this entry that suggests anything other than the routine of a quiet day at sea. Yet, in its very ordinariness, it captures the essence of the maritime experience, the steady, unhurried rhythm of life on the edge of the world. It is a reminder that history is not just made of great events, but of the accumulation of countless quiet moments, each one as significant as the last in the long chronicle of the sea. As we transition toward the next segment of our journey, the image of the lighthouse remains clear in our minds. It is a beacon of stability, a point of reference in a world of movement. The light continues its rotation, the oil burns steadily in the lamps, and the keeper records the passage of the night in his ledger. The sea remains as it has always been, vast, rhythmic, and infinitely patient. We are merely observers, listeners to the quiet history that unfolds in the archives of the deep, a history that speaks of distant shores, famous names, and the timeless voyages that have shaped our understanding of the world. The night is long, and the chronicles are many, and there is much more to explore in the silence of the maritime sleep. The transition from the open sea to the structured vigilance of the shoreline is marked not by a sudden shift, but by a gradual thickening of the atmosphere, a change in the scent of the air from the sharp, salt spray clarity of the deep Atlantic to the heavier, earth-laden dampness of the coastal shelf. In these hours of the middle watch, we turn our attention to the meticulous records of the northern latitudes, specifically the year 1811, when the construction of the Bell Rock Lighthouse was nearing its first full season of operation off the coast of Angus. The ledger of Robert Stevenson, the engineer whose lineage would define the Scottish coast for generations, remains a testament to the slow, rhythmic labor of stone upon stone. One can almost hear the rhythmic clinking of the mason's chisels against the heavy blocks of Aberdeen granite and Milnerfield sandstone, a sound that defined the low-tide hours when the reef was exposed to the biting North Sea air. Each block was carved with a dovetail joint, a precise mathematical interlocking designed to withstand the hydraulic pressure of the shifting tides. The records indicate that during the winter months, when the seas rendered the rock inaccessible, the work did not cease but moved to the workyard at Arbroath, where each course of the tower was pre-assembled on dry land to ensure a perfect fit before being transported by the lighthouse tender, the Smeaton, named in honor of the pioneer of the Eddystone. As we drift further into the archival depths of the 19th century, we find that the life of a lighthouse keeper was governed by the consumption of oil and the meticulous cleaning of glass. Before the widespread adoption of the hollow-wick argand lamp, the light was often a guttering, smoky affair, fueled by the rendered fat of marine mammals or the heavy, golden viscosity of colza oil, derived from rapeseed. The journals of the keepers at the Cordouan in France, the oldest lighthouse in the country, describe the labor of maintaining the parabolic reflectors, which required constant polishing with rouge and soft leathers to prevent the salt air from dulling their silvered surfaces. The light was not merely a flame, but an optical machine, a catoptric system that preceded the elegant, tiered glass of the Fresnel lens. By 1823, Augustine Fresnel's invention began to transform the coastlines of the world, replacing the crude reflectors with concentric rings of hand-ground glass that captured the stray rays of light and folded them into a single, potent horizontal beam. In the quiet of the watch room, the only sound would be the slow, heavy tick of the clockwork mechanism, a system of weights and pulleys that rotated the entire optical apparatus, ensuring that the characteristic flash of the light remained as constant as the rotation of the stars. Moving southward across the hydrographic charts, we encounter the records of the great surveying voyages, such as those of the HMS Beagle under the command of Captain Robert Fitzroy. While history often focuses on the biological observations made during these years, the ship's logs are primarily concerned with the slow, repetitive task of sounding the depths and charting the intricate, fragmented coastline of Tierra del Fuego. The Beagle carried 22 chronometers, each housed in its own padded compartment to protect it from the vibrations of the hull. These instruments were the silent heartbeat of the ship, their steady ticking providing the necessary data to determine longitude with a precision previously unknown to the Admiralty. The process of taking a sounding involved the lead line, a length of hemp marked with knots and pieces of leather, at the end of which sat a heavy lead weight with a hollowed base filled with tallow. When the lead hit the seabed, the tallow would capture a sample of the bottom, fine gray sand, crushed shells, or smooth pebbles, providing the navigator with a tactile map of the unseen world beneath the keel. The logs reflect a pace of life that was dictated by the weather and the tides, with days spent at anchor in secluded coves, waiting for the mists to clear so that the sextant could be used to take a noon sight. The provisioning of such voyages was a study in preservation and the slow passage of time. The hold of a 19th-century survey vessel was a cellar of salted meats, hardtack biscuits, and casks of water that grew increasingly stagnant as the months progressed. The ledger of a voyage to the South Shetlands in 1821 lists the contents of the stores with a dry, rhythmic repetition: 300 barrels of flour, 20 tisses of beef, 40 bushels of peas, and a significant quantity of lemon juice to ward off the scurvy that shadowed every long-distance endeavor. The smell of the ship was one of damp oak, tarred hemp, and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from the galley stove. Sleep for the crew was found in the swaying rhythm of the hammock, a canvas cradle that moved in equilibrium with the rolling of the ship, creating a sense of weightlessness that disconnected the sailor from the harsh realities of the gale outside. The creaking of the ship's timbers, the working of the vessel as it climbed over a swell, was a constant, low-frequency lullaby, a reminder of the ship's integrity against the immense weight of the ocean. In the late 18th century, the exploration of the Pacific by Captain James Cook on the HMS Resolution brought the European world into contact with the vast, unmapped expanses of the Great Southern Ocean. The journals of these voyages are remarkably devoid of drama, focusing instead on the daily observation of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Cook's mastery of the lunar distance method allowed for the calculation of longitude at sea, a process that required hours of meticulous mathematical reduction using the tables provided in the nautical almanac. The atmosphere on the quarterdeck during these observations was one of quiet concentration, the only movement being the steady adjustment of the sextant's mirrors to bring the limb of the moon into contact with a distant star. The charts produced during these voyages, such as those of the New Zealand coastline, were so accurate that they remained in use for over a century, their fine copperplate engravings capturing every headland, bay, and submerged rock with a clarity that belied the turbulent conditions under which they were surveyed. The lighthouses of the American coast, particularly those of the windswept reaches of the Pacific Northwest, tell a similar story of endurance and the measurement of time. At Tillamook Rock, situated off the coast of Oregon, the construction of the light station in the late 1870s required the blasting of a level platform atop a jagged, basaltic monolith. The keepers assigned to terrible Tillies were isolated for months at a time, their world reduced to the circular gallery of the lantern room and the relentless roar of the Pacific against the rock below. The logs here record the slow accumulation of soot on the glass, the consumption of coal for the steam-powered fog signal, and the arrival of the supply tender, which could only deliver its cargo by means of a derrick and a precarious breeches buoy. The routine was unwavering, the trimming of the wicks at sunset, the winding of the clockwork every 4 hours, and the cleaning of the brasswork in the quiet hours of the morning. There is a profound stillness in these records, a sense of a life lived in harmony with the cyclical nature of the light and the sea. As we look toward the frozen horizons of the north, the annals of the search for the Northwest Passage reveal a different kind of maritime endurance. The ships of the mid-19th century, such as the HMS Erebus and Terror, were reinforced with massive internal timbers and iron plating to withstand the crushing pressure of the pack ice. The records of the Franklin expedition, though sparse and recovered years later from stone cairns on King William Island, speak of the slow transition from sailing to wintering. When a ship became inept by the ice, it ceased to be a vessel and became a stationary dwelling, a wooden island in a world of white. The sails were furled, the topmasts often struck, and a roof of heavy tilt cloth was erected over the deck to create a sheltered space for the crew to exercise. The journals describe the long Arctic night, where the only light came from the dim glow of oil lamps and the ethereal shimmer of the aurora borealis. The silence of the ice was absolute, broken only by the occasional sharp report of a floe cracking under the pressure of the tide, a sound like a distant cannon shot echoing across the frozen waste. The evolution of the trade routes between the East Indies and Europe further illustrates the slow, methodical nature of maritime history. The Great East Indiaman, ships of immense tonnage and stately pace, followed the trade winds in a predictable arc across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Their cargo manifests are a sensory catalogue of the 19th century world: chests of Bohemian Hyson tea, bales of raw silk, casks of indigo, and bags of black pepper. The voyage from Canton to the London docks could take 6 months, a period of time in which the ship became its own self-contained society. The officers' logs record the daily progress in leagues, the sighting of wandering albatrosses in the southern latitudes, and the crossing of the equator, marked by the traditional ceremonies that broke the monotony of the long passage. The navigational instruments used, the octant, the box chronometer, and the telltale compass mounted in the ceiling of the captain's cabin, were the tools of a trade that relied on patience and the accumulation of small, daily certainties. In the archives of the Trinity House, the authority responsible for the lighthouses of England and Wales, there are folders dedicated to the maintenance of light vessels. These were ships without engines, moored permanently in treacherous waters where a stone tower could not be built, such as the Goodwin Sands or the Seven Stones Reef. A light vessel was a sentinel of the shallows, its red-painted hull and high-mounted lantern serving as a stationary beacon for the passing channel traffic. The life of a light vessel crew was one of stationary seafaring. They experienced all the motion of the sea without the progress of a voyage. The logs describe the immense strain on the anchor chains during a gale, the rhythmic tolling of the manual fog bell, and the quiet hours spent in the cramped quarters below deck, where the sound of the water rushing past the hull was a constant presence. The light vessel was a bridge between the solid certainty of the land and the fluid unpredictability of the deep water, a point of fixity in a shifting world. The hydrographic surveys of the Mediterranean, conducted by British and French naval vessels in the 1840s, provide a more detailed look at the coastal geography of the ancient world. The surveyors moved slowly along the coasts of Greece and Turkey, measuring the depths of harbors that had been used since antiquity. Their reports are filled with descriptions of submerged ruins, the ruins of Venetian fortifications, and the specific qualities of the local winds, such as the meltemi that scoured the Aegean in the summer months. The drawing of a chart was a slow process of triangulation, where the positions of prominent landmarks, a mountain peak, a church spire, or a lonely watchtower, were plotted with a theodolite to create a geometric skeleton of the coast. These charts were then engraved onto copper plates, a labor-intensive process that required the skill of a master artist to capture the delicate harshours of the topography and the elegant script of the soundings. In the late 19th century, the transition from sail to steam brought a new rhythm to the maritime world, but the old ways persisted in the tea-clippers and the great nitrate barks that rounded Cape Horn. These vessels, such as the Cutty Sark or the Herzog in Sicily, were the pinnacle of wooden and iron shipbuilding, designed for speed but still entirely dependent on the vagaries of the wind. The logs of a Cape Horn passage are a study in atmospheric pressure and the shifting colors of the sea, from the deep indigo of the tropics to the slate gray of the Southern Ocean. The sailor's work was a constant dialogue with the rigging, the hauling of braces, the reefing of topsails, and the endless task of tarring the standing rigging to protect it from the corrosive salt. The sound of the wind in the wires, a high-pitched Aeolian hum, was the soundtrack to their lives, its pitch rising and falling with the intensity of the breeze. The history of the sea is also a history of the seabed, of the cables that began to lace the oceans together in the mid-19th century. The laying of the transatlantic telegraph cable by the Great Eastern in 1866 was a voyage of immense technical complexity, conducted at a walking pace. The ship moved slowly across the Atlantic, paying out the copper core encased in gutta-percha and armored with iron wire. The engineers in the cable tanks monitored the electrical continuity of the line, listening for the faint clicks of the galvanometer that signaled the cable was still alive. This was a voyage not of discovery, but of connection, a slow stitching together of the continents that required a steady hand and a calm sea. The Great Eastern, a vessel of unprecedented size, moved with a majestic stability, her paddle wheels and screw propeller working in tandem to maintain the precise heading required for the cable's placement. As we return to the quiet of the lighthouse, we consider the architecture of the towers themselves. In the mid-19th century, the construction of the Wolf Rock Lighthouse off the coast of Cornwall represented a triumph of Victorian engineering. The tower was built on a rock that was submerged for much of the year, requiring the use of a massive iron crane to lift the granite blocks into place. The design of the tower, with its gentle inward curve or lenticus, was not merely for aesthetic appeal but to deflect the force of the breaking waves, allowing the water to slide upward and away from the structure. Inside, the rooms were circular and vaulted, each stone precisely cut to form a self-supporting dome. The staircase, a spiral of stone steps cantilevered from the outer wall, led upward through the oil store, the living quarters, and the light room to the lantern itself. The atmosphere inside the tower was one of cool, dampened stone, the thick walls insulating the keepers from the roar of the wind, creating a sanctuary of order in the midst of the maritime wilderness. The archival records of the United States Lighthouse Board provide a glimpse into the lives of the keepers at the remote stations of the Florida Keys. At Carysfort Reef, the lighthouse was an iron screw pile structure, its legs bored deep into the coral to provide a stable foundation in the hurricane-prone waters. The keepers here lived in a dwelling suspended above the waves, the sea visible through the floorboards of the gallery. Their journals record the intense heat of the tropical sun, the clarity of the water where the shadows of sharks and rays could be seen moving over the sandy bottom, and the regular maintenance of the Fresnel lens, which had to be shielded from the sun's rays during the day to prevent the intense heat from damaging the brass fittings. The arrival of the Lighthouse tender with its cargo of fresh water and mail was the highlight of the month, a brief connection to the world beyond the reef before the silence of the sea returned. In the quiet continuity of maritime history, the voyage is never truly over. It is merely a pause in the long record of human interaction with the sea, a collection of ledger entries, logbook notations, and hydrographic observations that form a vast, unhurried narrative. The instruments of the past, the brass sextant, the wooden quadrant, the glass-encased chronometer, remain as relics of a time when the world was measured by the pace of the wind and the accuracy of the stars. The lighthouses, whether still active or standing as silent monuments to a bygone era, continue to mark the threshold between the known and the unknown, their beams a steady pulse in the darkness. As we move through these archival fragments, we are reminded of the slow, rhythmic labor that built the maritime world, a world of stone and timber, oil and glass, and the infinite, rolling expanse of the sea. The logs of the 19th century whaling ships, such as those that sailed from New Bedford or Nantucket, offer a different perspective on the timeless voyage. These journeys often lasted 3 or 4 years, the ships wandering across the Pacific and Arctic Oceans in search of their quarry. The journals are filled with the details of the try works, the brick furnaces on the deck where the blubber was rendered into oil, the smoke staining the sails a dark, greasy grey. But between the periods of intense activity, there were weeks of gamming, where 2 ships would meet in the middle of the ocean and the crews would exchange news and letters. The silence of the doldrums, where the ship sat motionless on a sea of glass, is recorded with a sense of profound stillness, the only movement being the slow swell of the water and the occasional creak of the rudder. The sailors spent these hours in scrimshaw, the delicate carving of whale ivory or bone into intricate scenes of ships and sea creatures, a patient art form that mirrored the slow passage of their lives at sea. In the archives of the French Hydrographic Service, there are detailed maps of the coast of Brittany, a region known for its treacherous currents and jagged rocks. The lighthouses here, such as the Fer du Criac or the Amen, are legendary for their isolation and the difficulty of their construction. Amen, built on a tiny rock that was barely visible above the waves, took 14 years to complete, with workmen often only able to land for a few hours each year. The records of the construction are a testament to human persistence, a slow accumulation of granite and cement in the face of the Atlantic's fury. The keepers who served there lived in a world of verticality, their lives spent climbing the spiral stairs between the engine room and the lantern, the sound of the sea a constant, heavy presence against the walls. The light they tended was a beacon of safety for the ships navigating the Ras de Seine, a narrow passage of turbulent water that has claimed countless vessels over the centuries. The journals of the early Antarctic explorers, such as James Clark Ross on the HMS Erebus in the 1840s, describe the first encounters with the Great Ice Barrier, now known as the Ross Ice Shelf. The ships moved along the towering wall of ice, which rose 200 feet above the water, a flat-topped cliff of purest white that stretched as far as the eye could see. The logs record the temperature of the seawater, the sightings of emperor penguins, and the constant vigilance required to avoid the tabular icebergs that drifted in the current. The ships were small specks in a vast, monochrome landscape, their wooden hulls dwarfed by the scale of the ice. The sense of isolation in these records is profound, a feeling of having reached the very edge of the world, where time is measured not by hours, but by the slow movement of the glacier and the seasonal arrival of the sun. As we conclude this segment of the Maritime Chronicles, we return to the image of the harbour at night, where the lights of the various beacons and buoys create a map of safety in the darkness. The harbour ledger at Portsmouth or Plymouth, with its rows of neat, copperplate script, records the arrival of every vessel, from the smallest coastal hoy to the largest first-rate ship of the line. Each entry is a fragment of a larger story, a record of a voyage completed, a cargo delivered, and a crew returned to the solid certainty of the land. The smell of the harbour is a mixture of mud, salt, and the faint scent of roasting coffee from the nearby docks, a sensory reminder of the global connections forged by the sea. The history of the maritime world is a history of these quiet moments, of the steady work and the patient observation that have defined our relationship with the oceans for centuries. The light in the tower continues to turn, the clockwork mechanism continues to tick, and the sea continues its rhythmic pulse against the shore, a timeless cycle that carries us into the deep, unhurried stillness of the night. The hour has turned toward the middle watch, that silent period between midnight and the first graying of the eastern horizon, where the history of the sea feels less like a sequence of events and more like a continuous, rhythmic breath. We find ourselves now drifting away from the sheltered harbors of the mainland, moving toward the isolated outposts of the North Atlantic, where the transition from sail to steam was marked not by sudden change, but by a slow, decades-long accumulation of coal dust upon white-painted decks and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the reciprocating engine. It is here, in the cold, salt-streaked reaches of the Hebrides and the rugged coastlines of the Northern Isles, that the chronicles of the Northern Lighthouse Board reside, preserved in the copperplate handwriting of clerks and the precise, technical ledgers of the Stevenson engineers. In the year 1869, the construction of the Dub Artak Lighthouse was nearing a state of functional completion, a feat of masonry that remains one of the most quietly remarkable achievements of the Victorian maritime era. To understand the stillness of this place, one must consider the basalt rock itself, a desolate, dark scurry rising barely 15 feet above the high water mark, situated some 15 miles southwest of the Isle of Mull. The archival records of the time describe the site as a place where the Atlantic swell, having traveled thousands of miles without interruption, meets the first resistance of the Scottish coast. The stones for the tower were not quarried locally, but were shaped on the island of Uaid, where masons worked with a slow, deliberate precision, numbering each block of granite so that they might fit together with a tolerance of less than 1/16 of an inch. Each stone was a dovetail, locked into its neighbor, creating a monolithic structure designed to withstand the hydraulic pressure of waves that, during winter gales, were recorded to have crested at heights far exceeding the lantern gallery. If we look into the ledger of the lighthouse tender *Pharos*, we see the lists of provisions delivered during the summer months, barrels of salt beef, sacks of oatmeal, canisters of tea, and the vital, heavy drums of colza oil. Before the widespread use of paraffin, it was the oil pressed from rapeseed that fueled the great lamps. It was a viscous, golden fluid, stored in large cisterns in the lower levels of the tower, where the temperature remained constant and cool, insulated by several feet of solid stone. The keepers, in their wool spirits and heavy trousers, moved through the circular rooms of the tower with a practiced economy of motion. Their routines were dictated by the mechanical clockwork that rotated the lens, a massive assembly of glass prisms that required winding every few hours, the heavy weights descending slowly through the central shaft of the spiral staircase. There is a particular quality to the light within a Fresnel lens, a refractive brilliance that transforms the flickering flame of a multi-wick burner into a concentrated beam of singular purpose. At Dub Artak, The optic was a first-order lens, a masterpiece of optical engineering designed by Thomas Stevenson. The prisms were cast in France at the workshops of Sauter, Lemonnier and Say, and transported with the delicacy of porcelain. When one stands, in the mind's eye, within the lantern room during a night of calm weather, the only sound is the low hiss of the pressurized oil lamp and the faint, metallic click of the rotation carriage. Outside, the world is a vast, indigo void, punctuated only by the rhythmic sweep of the beam across the dark surface of the sea, a silent signal to the mariners navigating the treacherous approaches to the Firth of Lorne. The history of the sea is also a history of the charts that describe it, the hydrographic surveys that gradually filled the blank spaces of the Admiralty maps with soundings and bottom characteristics. In the mid-19th century, the survey vessel HMS Lightning worked these waters, her crew lowering lead lines into the cold depths to record the nature of the seabed, fine grey sand, broken shells, or the hard, unforgiving rock that the mariners called foul ground. These surveys were conducted with a methodical patience that mirrors the slow passage of time at sea. A single chart might represent years of labor, of rowing in open boats, of measuring angles with sextants from prominent headlands, and of watching the rise and fall of the tide against a painted gauge. The language of these charts is a poetry of utility, conspicuous tower, tide rips, eddy, and the hauntingly simple position doubtful. We turn our attention now to the voyage of the Discovery not in her later, more famous Antarctic expeditions, but in the quiet, preparatory years of the late 19th century. The ship itself was a vessel of transition, built of solid oak and elm, sheathed in greenheart to resist the grinding pressure of the ice. Her logs reflect the meticulous nature of polar preparation, the stowing of thousands of tins of preserved meats, the calibration of magnetic instruments in the quiet observatories of Kew, and the selection of a crew whose temperaments were suited to long periods of isolation. The journals of the officers often dwell on the minutiae of the day, the temperature of the spirit thermometers, the thickness of the ice floes, and the subtle shifts in the color of the sky that heralded a change in the weather. There was no urgency in these records, only a steady accumulation of data, a commitment to the slow unveiling of the Earth's most distant reaches. In the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, there exists a series of photographs from this era, captured on glass plates that have preserved the stillness of the Arctic summer. They show ships held fast in the ice, their rigging coated in a fine layer of hoarfrost, looking like ghosts of the maritime past. The sailors in these images are often seen engaged in the mundane tasks of maintenance, chipping ice from the decks, mending sails in the warmth of the lower hold, or tending to the dogs that were their constant companions. The silence of the high latitudes is a presence in these records, a profound quiet that was only broken by the occasional groan of the pack ice or the distant, muffled sound of a calving glacier. As we move further south, toward the warmer latitudes of the mid-Atlantic, the rhythm of maritime life shifts. Here, the trade winds provided a steady, reliable force that propelled the great clipper ships on their long voyages to the east. The Cutty Sark and the Thermopylae names that evoke a vanished era of speed and grace, were in reality environments of intense, rhythmic labor. The logs of these vessels are filled with the details of the wind, steady breeze from the northeast, light airs, heavy squalls. The transition through the doldrums, that belt of calms near the equator, was a period of profound stillness. The ships would sit motionless on a sea like glass, their sails hanging limp, while the crew performed the endless tasks of scraping and painting, ensuring that the hull remained clean and the brightwork polished. The provisioning of such voyages was an exercise in logistics that required months of planning. A ledger from a London merchant in 1874 lists the requirements for a voyage of 6 months: 3 tons of ship's biscuit, 20 barrels of pork, 10 casks of flour, and a significant quantity of lime juice to ward off the effects of scurvy. These supplies were stored in the dark, cool recesses of the hold, their consumption carefully monitored by the ship's steward. The diet was monotonous, a repetition of flavors that defined the passage of time as much as the changing constellations overhead. On Sunday mornings, it was the custom on many ships for the crew to wash their clothes in seawater and for the captain to read the articles of war or a simple service, a moment of communal reflection in the vastness of the ocean. Returning to the lighthouses, we consider the isolation of the longships, situated on a cluster of rocks off Land's End. The original tower, built in 1795, was found to be too low, its light often obscured by the very seas it was meant to warn against. The replacement, completed in 1873 by Sir James Douglas, was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering. The construction required the use of a specialized workboat, the Hercules *, which moved the massive granite blocks into place during the brief windows of calm weather provided by the summer tides. The light at longships was a white flash, a signal that could be seen for 18 miles, marking the entrance to the English Channel for vessels arriving from the Americas. The life of a lighthouse keeper at longships was one of disciplined solitude. The journals kept by the head keepers are models of brevity and focus. Wind SW, force 5. Visibility 10 miles. Performed routine cleaning of the lens. Oil consumption 3 gallons. All well. These entries, repeated day after day, year after year, form a record of a life lived in service to a stationary object. There was a profound dignity in this repetition, a commitment to the safety of others that required no audience and no praise. The keepers would spend their off-duty hours in various pursuits, making models of ships in bottles, knitting heavy wool sweaters, or reading from the small library of books provided by the Lighthouse Board. The sound of the sea was their constant companion, a white noise that eventually became indistinguishable from silence. In the late 19th century, the development of the submarine telegraph cable added a new dimension to maritime history. The cable-laying ships, such as the Great Eastern *, were massive vessels that carried thousands of miles of copper wire insulated with gutta-percha. The process of laying the cable was one of extreme delicacy, requiring the ship to maintain a constant, slow speed while the cable was paid out from enormous tanks in the hold. The logs of the Great Eastern * describe the tension of the cable, the precise readings of the galvanometers, and the quiet satisfaction of a successful connection between continents. It was a voyage that bridged the gap between the old world of sail and the new world of instant communication, yet it was conducted with the same patience and attention to detail that had characterized maritime exploration for centuries. The hydrographic surveys of the Pacific Islands, conducted by vessels like HMS Challenger in the 1870s, revealed a world beneath the waves that had previously been the subject of myth and speculation. The Challenger expedition was a scientific voyage of unprecedented scope, equipped with laboratories and specialized winches for dredging the ocean floor. The scientists on board, led by Wyville Thompson, collected thousands of specimens of marine life, many of which had never been seen by human eyes. Their reports, published in 50 massive volumes, are a testament to the slow, methodical nature of scientific discovery. They recorded the temperature of the water at various depths, the salinity of the sea, and the composition of the ooze that covered the abyssal plains. The Challenger's stay in the port of Halifax, Nova Scotia, in 1873, is recorded in the local newspapers of the time as a quiet event, a brief pause in a long and arduous journey. The crew spent their time refitting the ship and replenishing their supplies, while the scientists organized their collections and prepared their notes. It was a moment of stillness in a voyage that spanned nearly 70,000 nautical miles. The city of Halifax itself, with its deep, ice-free harbor and its long history as a naval base, provided a familiar refuge for the sailors. The sound of the foghorn on Chebucto Head, a low, tectonic moan that echoed across the water, was a constant reminder of the hazards that lay just beyond the harbor mouth. We find ourselves now considering the role of the pilot, that local expert who guided the great ships through the intricacies of coastal navigation. In the harbors of the world, New York, Liverpool, Hong Kong, Sydney, the pilot boats were a constant presence, small, sturdy schooners that braved the worst weather to meet the incoming vessels. The pilots possessed a knowledge that was both practical and intuitive, a mental map of the shoals, currents, and landmarks that defined their home waters. The transfer of the pilot from his small boat to the towering side of a merchant ship was a maneuver of practiced skill, often conducted in the dark or in heavy seas. Once on board, the pilot would take his place on the bridge, his presence bringing a sense of calm and certainty to the final stages of a long voyage. The logs of the pilot cutters are filled with the names of the vessels they served, the Adriatic *, the Lusitania *, the City of Paris star. These ships, the giants of the steam age, were marvels of engineering, their triple expansion engines capable of driving them across the Atlantic in a matter of days. Yet, even these modern vessels were subject to the ancient laws of the sea, the tides and the winds that had governed the movements of ships since the beginning of time. The transition from sail to steam did not diminish the importance of the lighthouse or the chart. Rather, it increased the need for precision and reliability in all aspects of navigation. In the quiet of the Maritime archive, one can find the blueprints for the great steamships, the intricate drawings of their boilers, engines, and hulls. These documents are masterpieces of technical illustration, their fine lines and delicate washes of color representing the pinnacle of Victorian industrial design. The ships themselves were floating cities, with their own hierarchies and routines, their own sounds and smells. The scent of hot oil and steam in the engine room, the crisp, salty air of the upper decks, and the faint, earthy smell of the cargo in the holds, all of these combined to create a unique sensory environment. The voyagers of this era, whether they were explorers, scientists, or ordinary passengers, were part of a continuous tradition of movement across the water. Their experiences were shaped by the physical realities of the sea, by the strength of the timber and the reliability of the compass. The instruments of navigation, the sextant, the chronometer, the lead line, were the tools of their trade, used with a quiet competence that was the hallmark of the professional mariner. A chronometer, housed in its brass-bound mahogany box and suspended in gimbals to keep it level, was more than just a timepiece. It was a vital link to the prime meridian, a means of determining longitude that had transformed the nature of ocean travel. As the night deepens, we reflect on the timeless nature of the voyage. The sea does not change, even as the ships that traverse it evolve. The waves that broke against the hull of the Discovery are the same waves that washed over the decks of the Phoenician galleys and the Viking longships. The lighthouses, with their steady, rhythmic pulses of light, continue to serve as beacons of safety in a world that is often uncertain. The chronicles of the sea are a testament to human persistence, to the desire to explore the unknown and to return safely to the familiar shores of home. Consider the lighthouse at Minnett's Ledge, off the coast of Massachusetts. The first tower, built on iron pilings, was swept away in a great storm in 1851, a reminder of the raw power of the Atlantic. The replacement, a massive granite structure completed in 1860, remains a testament to the skill of the engineers who designed it. The stones were cut and fitted on land, then transported to the ledge and lowered into place by a specialized derrick. The work could only be done during the low tides of the summer months, a slow and painstaking process that required years of labor. The lighthouse is known for its unique characteristic, a 1-4-3 flash pattern, often interpreted as "I love you," a gentle signal that has guided generations of mariners into the safety of Boston Harbor. The routine of the keepers at Minnett's Ledge was much like that of their counterparts at Dub Artak or the Longships. Their lives were defined by the maintenance of the light and the observation of the sea. They recorded the passage of ships, the sightings of whales and seabirds, and the ever-changing patterns of the weather. Their journals are filled with the details of their work, the polishing of the brass, the cleaning of the glass, the careful measurement of the oil. It was a life of slow, deliberate action, a life that was attuned to the rhythms of the natural world. In the annals of maritime exploration, the voyage of the *Fram*, led by Fridtjof Nansen in the 1890s, stands as a model of patient endurance. The ship was uniquely designed with a rounded hull, intended to be lifted by the ice rather than crushed by it. Nansen's plan was to allow the *Fram* to be frozen into the Arctic pack and to drift with the currents across the North Pole. The voyage lasted 3 years, a period of profound isolation and stillness. The crew occupied themselves with scientific observations, the maintenance of the ship, and the preparation of their meals. The journals from the *Fram* describe the beauty of the aurora borealis, the sound of the ice grinding against the hull, and the quiet satisfaction of their slow progress toward the north. The history of the sea is also a history of the ports that served as the gateways to the world. The harbor at Singapore, with its bustling trade in spices, silk, and tea, was a crossroads of cultures and commodities. The ledgers of the harbor master record the arrival and departure of vessels from every corner of the globe, Dutch merchantmen, British steamers, Chinese junks. The air was filled with the scents of the tropics and the sounds of 1,000 different languages. Yet, even in the midst of this activity, there was a sense of order and routine, a commitment to the steady flow of trade that defined the life of the port. As we move toward the conclusion of this segment, we return to the quiet of the lighthouse, where the beam continues its steady rotation. The light is a constant in a changing world, a symbol of stability and hope. The chronicles of the sea, preserved in the logs, journals, and ledgers of the past, provide a window into a world that was defined by the slow, rhythmic passage of time. They remind us of the importance of patience, of the value of careful observation, and of the enduring beauty of the maritime world. The transition from the late 19th century into the early 20th was marked by a gradual increase in the scale and complexity of maritime operations. The great ocean liners, like the *Olympic* and the *Mauretania*, were the ultimate expressions of the steam age. Their massive hulls and powerful engines a testament to the industrial prowess of the era. Yet, even these magnificent vessels were subject to the same ancient laws of the sea that had governed the movements of the smallest sailing ships. The importance of the lighthouse, the chart, and the pilot remained undiminished, a constant reminder of the inherent hazards of ocean travel. In the archives of the French lighthouse service, the *Commission des Fers*, there are records of the installation of the first electric lights in the late 19th century. The lighthouse at La Hève, near Le Havre, was among the first to be converted. The transition from oil to electricity was a slow and deliberate process, requiring the installation of massive steam-driven generators and the training of the keepers in the new technology. The arc lamps of the era produced a brilliant, blue-white light that was far more powerful than the oil lamps it replaced. Yet, the fundamental purpose of the light remained the same: to provide a reliable signal to the mariner, a beacon of safety in the dark. The history of the sea is a tapestry woven from the threads of countless individual lives, the keepers of the light, the explorers of the unknown, the sailors who manned the great ships. Their stories are not marked by dramatic events or heroic deeds, but by a steady commitment to the tasks at hand, a quiet endurance in the face of the elements. It is a history of slow progress, of gradual change, and of the enduring power of the ocean. As the middle watch comes to an end, and the first light of dawn begins to touch the horizon, we find ourselves in a state of quiet reflection. The maritime world, with its rhythms and routines, its sounds and smells, its challenges and rewards, is a place of profound beauty and mystery. The chronicles of the distant lighthouses, the famous explorers, and the timeless voyages are a testament to the enduring human connection to the sea, a connection that is as old as time itself and as deep as the ocean itself. The logbook is closed for now, the ink dry on the page. The lantern continues its steady rotation, the beam sweeping across the dark water in a rhythmic, comforting pulse. The sea is calm, its surface reflecting the stars that still linger in the western sky. We are at peace, drifting on the quiet currents of history, ready to face the new day with a sense of calm and clarity. The silence of the night is a gift, a moment of stillness in a world that is always in motion. And so, we rest, held in the gentle embrace of the maritime past, as we wait for the sun to rise over the distant horizon. The archives of the maritime museums are filled with the artifacts of this vanished era, the brass sextants, the wooden blocks and tackle, the faded charts, and the oil lamps that once lit the way through the dark. Each object tells a story of its own, a story of labor, of skill, and of the enduring relationship between humanity and the sea. When we look at these objects, we are reminded of the slow, methodical nature of maritime history, of the patience and persistence that were required to navigate the world's oceans. In the quiet of the museum gallery, one can almost hear the sound of the wind in the rigging, the creak of the timber, and the rhythmic beat of the sea against the hull. The air is cool and still, the light soft and diffused. It is a place of contemplation, a place where the history of the sea comes alive in the quietest of ways. The chronicles of the maritime world are not just records of the past, they are a living legacy, a reminder of the enduring power of the ocean and the human spirit that has always sought to understand and navigate its vastness. The story of the light at Corduan, the patriarch of lighthouses, is a fitting example of this legacy. Situated at the mouth of the Gironde estuary in France, the tower has stood for over 4 centuries, a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture and maritime engineering. Its history is a record of constant adaptation and improvement, from the early wood-fired beacons to the sophisticated Fresnel lenses of the 19th century. The keepers of Corduan have lived and worked within its walls for generations, their lives defined by the maintenance of the light and the observation of the sea. The tower itself is a monument to the endurance of the maritime tradition, a beacon that has guided countless vessels into the safety of the port of Bordeaux. As we conclude this segment, we are reminded of the quiet continuity of the maritime world. The lighthouses still shine, the ships still sail, and the sea remains as vast and mysterious as ever. The history of the sea is a history of the human heart, of the desire to explore, to discover, and to find our way home. It is a story that is told in the quietest of voices, in the rhythmic beat of the waves and the steady pulse of the light. And it is a story that will continue as long as there are ships to sail and oceans to cross. The night is still, the world is at rest, and the chronicles of the maritime past are ours to keep. We drift now into a deeper sleep, held in the gentle embrace of the sea and the stories of those who have navigated its waters throughout the ages. The light is steady, the path is clear, and the voyage continues, quiet and timeless, toward the dawn of a new day. In the stillness of the archive, the ledgers remain, their pages filled with the records of 1,000 voyages, each one a testament to the enduring power of the maritime spirit. The ink is dark, the paper is aged, but the stories they tell are as fresh and vital as the sea itself. We are part of this history, part of this continuous journey across the water, and in the quiet of the night, we find our place within it. The sound of the distant surf is a lullaby, a rhythmic reminder of the ocean's presence. It is a sound that has comforted mariners for centuries, a sound that signals the proximity of the land and the safety of the harbor. As we listen to its gentle cadence, we are transported back to the decks of the great sailing ships, to the lantern rooms of the distant lighthouses, and to the quiet cabins of the explorers. We are at one with the sea, at one with its history, and at one with the timeless rhythm of the voyage. The light of the stars above is mirrored in the water below, creating a world of infinite peace and tranquility. And so, we sleep, drifting on the quiet currents of the maritime past, secure in the knowledge that the light will always be there to guide us home. The hour has grown quiet, and the tide has begun its long, deliberate withdrawal from the shingle beaches of the northern reaches, leaving behind only the rhythmic, percussive pulse of the swell against the granite foundations of the world's most solitary beacons. We turn our attention now to the year 1824, a period characterized by the meticulous expansion of the Northern Lighthouse Board's influence across the fractured, mist-heavy archipelago of the Inner Hebrides. It is a season of long twilights and the smell of dampened wool and bracken. On the charts of the hydrographers, the area known as the Skerryvore, a jagged, treacherous reef of basaltic rock lying some 12 miles southwest of the island of Tyree, remained a skeletal silhouette, a place of profound navigational anxiety for the masters of the timber-laden barks returning from the Americas. To understand the stillness of this place, one must consider the records of the Pharos, the tender vessel that carried the engineers, and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the chronometers in the cabins of men who measured progress not in leagues, but in the steady, incremental placement of dressed stone. The construction of a lighthouse in such a remote expanse was not an act of sudden conquest, but a patient negotiation with the Atlantic. Robert Stevenson, the patriarch of a dynasty of lighthouse builders, noted in his journals the particular quality of the light at Skerryvore, a pale, translucent gray that seemed to dissolve the horizon into a singular, seamless curtain of vapor. The provisioning for such a voyage was an exercise in archival precision. Ledgers from the period detail the stowage of barrels of salted beef, sacks of hard biscuit, and the heavy, tin canisters of colza oil intended for the experimental lamps of the era. There is a quietude in these lists, they represent the silent infrastructure of survival. One can almost hear the scratch of the quill against the parchment in the dim light of the harbour master's office, recording the weight of the wrought iron, the diameter of the brass fittings, and the specific gravity of the mortar mixtures designed to set beneath the cold, churning waters of the Minch. As we drift further into the mid-19th century, the focus shifts toward the southern latitudes, where the great explorers of the Victorian era sought the magnetic poles with a slow, grinding persistence. In 1841, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, under the command of James Clark Ross, moved through the pack ice of the Antarctic with a heavy, creaking dignity. These were not the swift vessels of modern imagination, but reinforced wooden fortresses, their hulls doubled with thick planks of African oak and sheathed in copper to withstand the relentless pressure of the floes. The sound of the ice against the hull was a constant, low-frequency vibration, a deep resonance that defined the daily lives of the men on board. The journals of the officers described the routine of the magnetic observations, the careful leveling of the dipped needles, the reading of the vernier scales by the light of a single tallow candle, and the marking of the hourly meteorological logs. There was no haste in these movements. The ice dictated the pace, and the men adapted, their lives measured by the slow swing of the pendulum and the steady consumption of the ship's stores. The air in these southern reaches was of a clarity that defied distance. Ross wrote of seeing the smoke of Mount Erebus rising in a slow, vertical column against a sky of bruised indigo, a landmark of fire in a kingdom of ice. The ship's surgeon, in his quiet moments between the monitoring of the crew's health and the pressing of botanical specimens, recorded the specific texture of the frost upon the rigging, how it grew in delicate, fern-like structures that would shatter with the gentlest vibration of the shrouds. This was a world of white and grey, where the only movement was the slow, tectonic shifting of the bergs and the occasional, silent passage of a wandering albatross. The voyage was a long meditation on the nature of persistence, a journey where the destination was often less significant than the act of remaining, of maintaining the vessel's integrity against the immense, indifferent forces of the Southern Ocean. Returning to the northern latitudes, we find the lighthouse keepers of the Bell Rock, that lonely sentinel off the coast of Angers, entering their winter vigil. The year is 1860, and the technology of illumination has reached a state of refined grace. The great Fresnel lens, a masterpiece of glass and brass, sits atop the tower, its concentric rings of prisms designed to capture and redirect the flickering light of the oil lamps into a single, concentrated beam that sweeps across the dark waters of the North Sea. The keeper's log is a document of profound repetition. At sunset, the glass is polished with chamois leather, the wicks are trimmed with silver shears, the weight-driven clockwork mechanism that rotates the lens is wound with a heavy, iron key. There is a rhythmic quality to this labor, a cycle of maintenance that mirrors the celestial movements above. The keeper records the height of the tide, the direction of the wind, south-southwest, steady, and the passage of distant sails, mere ghosts on the periphery of the light's reach. The interior of the lighthouse is a sanctuary of order. The walls are lined with white-painted brick, and the air carries the faint, not unpleasant scent of warm oil and sea salt. In the small library, the books are bound in sturdy leather, their pages yellowed by the dampness of the coast. The keeper might spend his off-watch hours reading the accounts of the early navigators, the voyages of Dampier or the surveys of Vancouver, finding a quiet kinship with those who mapped the edges of the known world. Outside, the waves break against the base of the tower with a sound like distant thunder, a reminder of the immense weight of the sea, yet inside, the flame remains steady, protected by the thick, curved glass of the lantern room. It is a stillness won through engineering, a pocket of human continuity in an environment of perpetual change. In the archives of the East India Company, there are records of the tea clippers that traversed the Indian Ocean in the 1870s, vessels like the Ariel and the Taiping, whose hulls were designed for a grace that seemed almost ethereal. These ships were the pinnacle of wooden shipbuilding, their masts reaching toward the heavens like the spires of great cathedrals. Yet, for all their speed, the reality of the voyage was one of long, sun-drenched calms in the doldrums, where the sails hung limp and the sea became a mirror of polished lead. During these periods, the crew would engage in the slow work of shipboard maintenance, the holystoning of the decks, the mending of the canvas, the intricate knotwork of the rigging. The sound of the marlinspike against the rope, the soft friction of the sandstone against the timber, the low murmur of voices in the heat of the afternoon. These were the sounds of a world suspended in time. The cargo manifests of these clippers are poetic in their dryness: chests of bohea and lapsang souching, silk from the looms of Canton, porcelain packed in rice husks to prevent breakage during the long roll of the Cape of Good Hope. Each item was a fragment of a distant world, carried across the vast, lonely stretches of the ocean with a care that bordered on the sacred. The navigation was an exercise in celestial patience. The navigator would stand upon the poop deck at dawn and dusk, his sextant held steady against the horizon, bringing the sun or the stars down to the silvered line of the sea. The calculations that followed, the consulting of the nautical almanac, the addition and subtraction of logarithms, were the quiet architecture of the voyage, the invisible threads that connected the ship to the ports of the world. Let us consider for a moment the design of the sea charts themselves, those vast sheets of heavy paper that served as the primary interface between the mariner and the unknown. In the late 19th century, the British Admiralty charts were masterpieces of understated detail. They featured delicate copperplate engravings of the coastline, with soundings marked in fathoms and the nature of the seabed described in abbreviated notations: M for mud, S for sand, Sh for shells. These charts were not merely maps, but historical records of every rock and shoal encountered by generations of surveyors. To look upon a chart of the Malacca Strait or the Labrador coast was to see the accumulated knowledge of centuries of quiet observation. The transitions between the deep blues of the open water and the pale washes of the shallows were rendered with a subtlety that mirrored the gradual shoaling of the sea. In the late autumn of 1888, the Lighthouse at Cape Race, on the southeastern tip of Newfoundland, stood as the final point of departure for vessels crossing the North Atlantic. It was a place of immense atmospheric density, where the cold currents from the Arctic met the warmer waters of the Gulf Stream, creating fogs so thick they seemed to have a physical weight. The foghorn at Cape Race, a massive, steam-driven instrument, would groan into the mist at regular intervals, a sound that carried for miles across the water like the lowing of a subterranean beast. The keepers here lived in a state of constant auditory immersion. Their logs record the days of thick weather with a stoic brevity, noting the consumption of coal for the steam boilers and the accumulation of rime on the lantern glass. There was a profound loneliness to the station, yet it was a loneliness shared by the unseen ships that signaled back with their own whistles, a dialogue of ghosts in the white silence. The provisioning of such a station was a logistical ballet performed once a year. The supply ship would arrive in the brief window of the Newfoundland summer, bringing barrels of flour, casks of molasses, and the essential crates of glass chimneys for the lamps. The unloading was done by whaleboat, the men rowing through the surf with a practiced, rhythmic stroke. There was a specific dignity in the way these goods were handled, passed from hand to hand up the steep, rocky path to the storehouse. These were the materials of survival, the quiet fuel for the long winter ahead. The records of these deliveries, kept in the ledgers of the Department of Marine and Fisheries, provide a window into a world where every nail and every gallon of oil was accounted for with a precision that speaks to the value of human life in the face of the elements. As we move toward the close of the century, the transition from sail to steam brought a new kind of quiet to the maritime world. The great liners of the 1890s, though faster, still moved with a heavy, deliberate grace. The engine rooms were cathedrals of polished steel and brass, where the rhythmic thud of the pistons provided a constant, reassuring heartbeat to the voyage. The stokers and engineers worked in a world of shadow and heat, their lives governed by the pressure gauges and the steady consumption of coal. Yet, on the upper decks, the experience remained one of vast horizons and the slow passage of time. The passenger lists, The menus printed on heavy cardstock, the morning reports from the bridge, all these documents reflect a society that valued the slow, methodical progression of the journey. In the quiet of the night, the bridge of a steamship was a place of profound focus. The officer of the watch would pace the teak decking, his eye scanning the horizon for the faint, rhythmic flash of a distant lighthouse. The telegraph, with its brass face and mahogany handle, stood ready to communicate with the engine room, but for hours at a time, no word would be spoken. The only sound was the rush of water along the hull and the occasional creak of the ship's structure as it met a long, rolling swell. The navigation was still a matter of the stars and the chronometer, a bridge between the ancient traditions of the sea and the burgeoning technology of the industrial age. The history of the sea is not a history of events, but a history of durations. It is the story of the long, unhurried watch, the steady accumulation of data in the hydrographic office, and the persistent maintenance of the lights that fringe the continents. It is a narrative found in the margins of the logbooks, in the descriptions of the color of the water, the shape of a cloud, or the specific gravity of the sea ice. As we consider these fragments of the past, we are reminded of the immense, silent continuity of the ocean, a realm where time moves differently, and where the rhythmic pulse of the tide and the steady sweep of the lighthouse beam are the only constants. We look now to the journals of the French explorer Dumont d'Urville, who in the 1830s sought to chart the intricate coastlines of the South Pacific. His vessels, the Astrolabe and the Zelee, moved through the coral-strewn waters of the Tuamotus with a caution that is palpable in the written record. The lead line was cast continuously, the leadsman calling out the depths in a low, melodic chant that echoed across the still lagoons. 5:15, by the Mark 7. These were the sounds of safety, the auditory confirmation of the seabed's topography. The charts produced by d'Urville's cartographers were delicate works of art, capturing the ephemeral beauty of the atolls and the hidden dangers of the reefs with a precision that would remain the standard for a century. The botanists on board these expeditions were men of immense patience. They would spend their days on the islands, collecting seeds, pressing leaves, and sketching the vibrant plumage of birds that had never before been seen by European eyes. Their field notes are filled with the details of the mundane, the texture of the bark, the scent of the crushed blossom, the temperature of the soil at midday. There is a profound stillness in these descriptions, a sense of a world being observed with a reverence that transcends the scientific. Back on the ship, these specimens were stored in heavy wooden chests, protected from the salt air by layers of oiled silk. They were the silent passengers of the voyage, carrying with them the essence of distant landscapes. In the northern reaches of the Baltic Sea, the lighthouses of the Gulf of Bothnia faced a different set of challenges. Built upon low-lying islands of granite and pine, these beacons were often isolated for months at a time by the encroaching ice. The keepers' houses were sturdy structures of timber and stone, designed to retain the heat of the great tile stoves that stood at their centers. The winter routine was one of interiority, the mending of nets, the carving of wooden bowls, the slow reading of the family Bible. The light itself, often a fixed white beam, shone out over a landscape of frozen white, marking the edge of a world that had become motionless. The logs from these stations speak of the Geistblink, a luminous glow on the horizon that signaled the presence of the pack, and the profound silence that falls when the sea ceases to move. The design of the Baltic lighthouses, such as the one at Bexkar, reflected a Stoic architectural philosophy. These were not the elegant tapers of the British coast, but robust, fortress-like towers that seemed to grow out of the very rock they protected. The granite blocks were quarried nearby, each one hand-dressed and fitted with a precision that precluded the need for mortar in the outer courses. In the quiet of the Finnish winter, the tower stood as a monument to human persistence, its light a steady, unwavering pulse in the darkness. The records of the Finnish Maritime Administration detail the provisioning of these lights, the barrels of salted herring, the sacks of rye flour, and the precious canisters of kerosene that had replaced the older oils. As we drift further into the late 19th century, we encounter the transoceanic cables that began to lace the seabed, connecting the continents in a web of silent communication. The cable-laying ships, such as the Great Eastern, were behemoths of their time, their holds filled with miles of copper wire insulated with gutta-percha. The process of laying the cable was one of extreme delicacy, a slow unspooling of the line into the abyssal depths. The engineers on board monitored the electrical continuity with galvanometers, the needles twitching in response to the faint pulses of energy. This was the birth of the modern world, yet it was achieved with a maritime patience that belonged to the age of sail. The cable ships moved at a walking pace, their progress measured by the odometer on the stern and the steady ticking of the telegraph. The journals of the cable engineers are filled with technical observations, the tension on the line, the temperature of the deep-sea water, the composition of the ooze recovered from the sounding machines. Yet, between the lines of data, there is a sense of the immense scale of the task. They were working in a realm of total darkness and crushing pressure, a landscape that no human eye would ever see. The silence of the deep ocean was mirrored by the quiet of the testing room, where the only sound was the breathing of the men and the soft click of the instruments. It was a voyage of connection, carried out with a quietude that belied its revolutionary impact. Returning once more to the solitary lighthouses of the Atlantic, we find ourselves at the Fastnet Rock, the teardrop of Ireland, standing on the edge of the continental shelf. The current tower, completed in 1904, is a masterpiece of Cornish granite, its stones dovetailed together in a three-dimensional puzzle of immense strength. The construction records detail the arrival of each stone from the quarries at Penryn, numbered and shaped to fit its specific place in the hierarchy of the tower. There is a profound satisfaction in the reading of these ledgers, the orderly progression of the courses, the gradual rise of the structure above the foam, the final installation of the great biform lens. The life of the fastnet keepers was one of extreme isolation and rhythmic labor. The rock is so small that there was nowhere to walk but the gallery of the lantern, where the Atlantic wind would buffet the stone with a constant, heavy pressure. The keeper's logs reflect a world narrow to the essentials, the condition of the light, the state of the weather, and the passage of the great liners on their way to New York. The arrival of the relief boat was the only break in the cycle, a moment of brief, intense activity before the rock returned to its habitual silence. The exchange of mail, the hauling up of fresh water, the brief conversation with the boatman, these were the threads that connected the keepers to the world they served. In the quiet of the museum archives, one can find the personal belongings of these men, the brass tobacco tins, the hand-knitted sweaters, the small, framed photographs of families left behind on the mainland. These objects carry the weight of the long hours spent in the shadow of the lens, the quiet dedication to a task that required no audience. The maritime history of our world is built upon these small, individual lives, the steady performance of duty in the most remote corners of the globe. As we conclude this segment of our journey, we turn to the final entries in the log of a mid-19th century survey vessel, anchored in a quiet bay on the coast of British Columbia. The sun is setting behind the cedar-clad hills, and the water is as smooth as a sheet of pewter. The surveyor records the final soundings of the day, his handwriting neat and unhurried. The anchor chain hangs vertical in the still water, and the only sound is the soft lap of the tide against the hull. The voyage has been long, the charts are nearly complete, and the vessel rests in a moment of perfect equilibrium. There is no urgency to the coming night, only the steady, rhythmic pulse of the natural world and the quiet knowledge of a task well done. The light in the cabin dims as the oil lamp burns low, and the history of the sea continues its long, slow unfolding, one quiet entry at a time. The transition from the open sea to the sanctuary of the harbor is a process measured not in minutes, but in the slow accumulation of depth soundings and the gradual sharpening of a distant light against the charcoal smudge of a coastal horizon. In this fifth segment of our chronicle, we turn our attention to the long, rhythmic endurance of the South Atlantic stations, specifically those lonely outposts that guided the East Indiamen on their return voyages from the Orient, and the meticulous, almost monastic life led by the keepers of the light at the Cape of Good Hope and the remote reaches of the South American coastline. It is a history written in the margins of hydrographic charts and the back pages of station ledgers, where the weather is recorded with a dry, unwavering consistency that mirrors the steady rotation of a first-order Fresnel lens. Consider the year 1860, a time when the transition from sail to steam was beginning to alter the cadence of global trade, yet the fundamental reliance on the lighthouse remained absolute. At the Agulhas Bank, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet in a slow, churning confluence of currents, the lighthouse stood as a sentinel of limestone and limewash. The lightkeepers here practiced a routine that had remained largely unchanged since the installation of the catadioptric apparatus. Their day began not at dawn, but at the extinguishing of the lamp, a moment of quiet finality when the sun's first rays rendered the burning of colza oil redundant. The heavy brass wicks were trimmed with surgical precision, the carbonized edges removed so that the flame of the following night would burn with a clean, white consistency. The glass chimneys were polished with chamois leather until the transparency was absolute, ensuring that not a single lumen of light was absorbed by the soot of the previous watch. In the archival records of the Trinity House and the various colonial maritime boards, one finds an extraordinary emphasis on the purity of the oil and the cleanliness of the optics. There is a specific, tactile quality to these descriptions, the scent of warm oil lingering in the lantern room, the cool touch of the polished brass handrails, and the rhythmic ticking of the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens. This mechanism, a marvel of mid-19th century engineering, relied on a system of weights that descended slowly through the central shaft of the tower. Every few hours, the keeper on duty would wind the heavy iron crank, a task that required a steady, unhurried strength, ensuring that the light maintained its characteristic flash, a signature as unique to that point of land as a thumbprint. Further west, along the rugged and often fog-shrouded coast of the Falkland Islands, or the Islas Malvinas, the light at Cape Pembroke offered a different kind of solace. Here, the landscape was one of wind-stunted tussock grass and the relentless grey swell of the Southern Ocean. The lighthouse, constructed of cast iron plates bolted together to withstand the ferocious gales, was a testament to the industrial endurance of the Victorian age. The logs from Cape Pembroke frequently mention the arrival of supply ships, vessels like the HMS Basilisk or the schooner Foam, which brought barrels of salted beef, sacks of hardtack, and the precious registers of mail that connected the keepers to a world that felt increasingly abstract. The arrival of a ship was not a moment of high drama, but rather a logistical exercise recorded in precise detail, the number of tons of coal offloaded, the condition of the spare glass panes, and the health of the assistant keeper. When we examine the journals of the explorers who navigated these same waters, men like Sir James Clark Ross or the officers of the Challenger expedition, we see the lighthouse through a different lens. To the explorer, the light was a verification of a calculation made days prior with a sextant and a chronometer. After weeks of dead reckoning through the overcast latitudes of the roaring 40s, the first sighting of a coastal light was a quiet confirmation of the mathematics of navigation. In the mid-watch, Beneath a sky where the Southern Cross hung suspended like a silver ornament, the navigator would stand on the quarterdeck, his eyes strained against the darkness, waiting for that rhythmic pulse on the horizon. It was a moment of profound continuity, a bridge between the celestial mechanics of the stars and the terrestrial reality of the reef. The provisioning of these distant stations was a feat of maritime endurance in itself. The tenders that serviced the lights were often sturdy, broad-beamed vessels, built to carry heavy loads of oil and coal into shallow, untested bays. The sailors who manned these tenders were experts in the art of the surfboat, knowing exactly how to time the swell to land a barrel of oil on a rocky ledge without rupturing the staves. There is a quiet beauty in the descriptions of these landings found in the annual reports of the Lighthouse Board, the meticulous listing of every bolt, every gallon of paint, and every bushel of potatoes. These lists represent the physical manifestation of the lighthouse's survival. Without the steady influx of these mundane materials, the light would eventually flicker and fade, leaving the coastline a dark and dangerous void. Inside the lighthouse, the atmosphere was one of disciplined domesticity. The keeper's quarters, often circular and tucked into the base of the tower or situated in a small stone cottage nearby, were models of efficiency. The furniture was often built-in, designed to maximize space and withstand the damp, salt-laden air. On the shelves, one might find a small collection of books, a Bible, a copy of Bowditch's Practical Navigator, and perhaps a well-worn volume of natural history. Many keepers became amateur naturalists, recording the migrations of seabirds or the flowering of coastal succulents in the margins of their official logs. They observed the world with a slow, patient gaze, noting exactly when the wandering albatross appeared or the precise date the ice began to form in the shadows of the cliffs. The transition of the light from sunset to sunrise was governed by the Book of Instructions, a document that dictated every action of the keeper with the weight of scripture. The lighting of the lamp was a ritual performed with a steady hand. The match was struck, the wicks were carefully raised, and the flame was nursed until it reached its optimal height. Then, the clockwork was engaged, and the great glass cathedral of the Fresnel lens began its slow, silent rotation. Outside, the world might be a chaos of sleet and spray, but inside the lantern room, there was only the low hum of the gears and the steady, warm glow of the lamp. The keeper would sit on a wooden stool, his back to the light, watching the reflection of the beams on the dark water below, a silent witness to the passing of the night. In the annals of the Royal Geographical Society, there are accounts of voyages that relied entirely on these fixed points of light to navigate the treacherous straits and channels of the southern hemisphere. The voyage of the HMS Beagle, under the command of Robert Fitzroy, is often remembered for its scientific contributions, but it was also a masterpiece of coastal surveying. Fitzroy's charts, some of which remained in use for over a century, were populated with the positions of future lighthouses, spots he identified as essential for the safety of future mariners. He understood that the map was incomplete without the light, and his journals reflect a deep appreciation for the permanence of these coastal markers. He wrote of an unfailing constancy of the beacons, a sentiment shared by every sailor who has ever sought the shelter of a harbor in a rising gale. The history of maritime navigation is, in many ways, a history of the refinement of light. We see this in the evolution of the optics, from the early parabolic reflectors made of polished silver and copper to the magnificent architectural achievements of Augustine Fresnel. The Fresnel lens, with its concentric rings of glass, was capable of capturing and refracting light that would otherwise be lost to the sky or the ground, bending it into a powerful, horizontal beam. These lenses were categorized by orders, with a first-order lens being the largest and most powerful, often standing over 10 feet tall and weighing several tons. To see a first-order lens in a distant lighthouse was to see a monument to human ingenuity, a silent giant that worked tirelessly to protect the lives of those at sea. As the 19th century drew to a close, the life of the lightkeeper remained one of profound isolation, yet it was an isolation that carried a deep sense of purpose. The journals from this period often reflect a quiet pride in the reliability of the light. A typical entry might read, October 14th, wind north-northwest. Sea moderate. Light burning bright and steady. Consumed for gallons, 2 quarts of oil. Glass polished. All well. There is a meditative quality to such writing, a rejection of the sensational in favor of the rhythmic and the reliable. It is the language of a person who understands that their contribution to the world is measured in the absence of catastrophe. The ships that pass these lights, the tea clippers like the Cutty Sark or the Thermopylae, and the great iron-hulled grain ships of the late Victorian era, carried with them the weight of global commerce. Their holds were filled with the products of distant lands, chests of Darjeeling tea, bales of Australian wool, and sacks of South American coffee. To the crews of these vessels, the lighthouse was a milestone, a sign that they were one day closer to the end of a voyage that might have begun for months prior. The sight of the light at Cape Lewin or the Lizard was a cause for a quiet, internal celebration, a moment to acknowledge the skill of the navigator and the resilience of the hull. In the archives of the various hydrographic offices, there are thousands of charts that bear the marks of these long voyages, faint pencil lines tracing the path of a ship across a vast, empty blue. These lines often converge near the lighthouses, creating a dense web of paths that illustrate the fundamental role of the beacon in the geometry of trade. Each line represents a story of endurance, of weeks spent in the damp hold or on the freezing rigging, of the taste of salt on the lips and the sound of the wind in the shrouds. And at the end of every line, there is the light, steady, unblinking, and indifferent to the struggles of the men who sought its guidance. The architecture of the lighthouses themselves varied according to the geography they occupied. In the coral-strewn waters of the Florida Keys or the Great Barrier Reef, the screw-pile lighthouse became a common sight, a skeletal structure of iron legs bored directly into the seabed, allowing the waves to pass through the frame rather than battering against a solid wall. These structures had a fragile, spindly appearance, yet they were remarkably resilient, standing firm against hurricanes that leveled stone buildings on the mainland. The keepers of these lights lived in a state of constant suspension, their world a small, octagonal room perched above the turquoise water, where the only sound was the rhythmic lap of the tide against the iron piles. In contrast, the lighthouses of the northern latitudes, those on the coast of Scotland or the rugged shores of Maine, were built of heavy granite, often quarried from the very ground they stood upon. These towers were designed to be part of the landscape, their thick walls providing a thermal mass that kept the interior cool in the summer and retained the heat of a small coal stove in the winter. The construction of these lights, such as the Bell Rock or the Skerryvore, represented the pinnacle of 19th century civil engineering. The stories of their building are told in the dry, technical reports of the Stevenson family, a dynasty of engineers who understood the temper of the sea better than perhaps any others. They wrote of the difficulty of landing stones on a reef that was only visible at low tide, and the patience required to wait for a calm sea to set a single course of masonry. The daily life of the lighthouse keeper was also a history of the small, the domestic, and the mundane. The journals often record the progress of a small kitchen garden, sheltered from the wind by a stone wall, where the keeper might grow a few hardy vegetables to supplement his rations. They mention the arrival of a new kitten to keep the mice away from the grain stores, or the repair of a torn oilskin coat. These details, though seemingly insignificant, provide a human scale to the vast, impersonal landscape of the maritime world. They remind us that the light was maintained not by a machine, but by a person who felt the cold, who appreciated a warm meal, and who found solace in the steady, familiar work of the tower. In the long history of maritime exploration, the lighthouse stands as a symbol of the transition from the unknown to the known. For the early explorers, the coastline was a series of hazards and mysteries, a place where a ship could be lost in an instant on an uncharted rock. But as the lighthouses were built, the coastline was slowly tamed, transformed into a series of predictable points and intervals. This process of mapping and lighting the world was a collective effort, involving thousands of individuals, engineers, sailors, keepers, and clerks, all working toward a common goal of safety and precision. As we move deeper into the night, the image of the lighthouse remains a central theme in our archival journey. We see it not as a place of drama, but as a place of quiet, persistent labor. We hear the sound of the wind around the lantern room, a low, mournful whistle that underscores the silence of the tower. We feel the subtle vibration of the clockwork mechanism, a heartbeat that marks the passage of the hours. And we recognize the light for what it truly is, a bridge across the darkness, a testament to the enduring human desire to find our way home. The ledgers of the South Atlantic trade routes often noted the specific characteristics of the water as a ship approached the coast of Africa. There was the green water that signaled the approach to the Agulhas bank, a change in color so subtle it could only be detected by an experienced eye. The logs of the East India Company's ships, such as the Earl of Balcarras or the Canning, frequently mentioned these shifts in the sea's hue, correlating them with the first sightings of the coastal beacons. The transition from the deep, indigo blue of the mid-ocean to the lighter, silt-laden green of the continental shelf was a silent herald of the journey's end. At the Cape of Good Hope, the lighthouse at Cape Point stood on a precipice so high that the light was often obscured by low-hanging clouds, a phenomenon known as the tablecloth. This necessitated the construction of a second, lower light, ensuring that ships could still find their bearings when the upper reaches were shrouded in mist. The records of the Cape Town Port Authority are filled with discussions regarding the height and placement of these lights, reflecting a deep understanding of the local meteorology. They discuss the prevailing southeasterly winds, the intensity of the winter storms, and the peculiar way the light refracted through the salt-heavy air. Inside the lighthouse, the keeper's duties extended beyond the lantern room. There was the maintenance of the fog signal, a massive steam-powered whistle or a heavy bronze bell that had to be sounded whenever the visibility dropped below a certain threshold. The sounding of the foghorn was a rhythmic, soul-stirring noise, a deep bass note that echoed off the cliffs and carried for miles across the water. In the logs, the duration of the fog was recorded with the same precision as the consumption of oil. Fog commenced at 0400 hours, signals sounded every 2 minutes until 1100 hours when visibility improved. The keeper would often stand by the signal, his ears ringing from the noise, watching the grey wall of the mist for any sign of a vessel's silhouette. The provisioning of the lights in these remote regions was often a cooperative effort between different nations. A British ship might deliver supplies to a French station on a remote island, or an American whaler might stop to share fresh water with a Chilean lighthouse keeper. This international camaraderie was born of a shared understanding of the sea's indifference to borders. The safety of one was the safety of all, and the light was a universal language that required no translation. In the museum archives, one can find letters of thanks exchanged between different maritime boards, expressing gratitude for the assistance rendered to a distant and lonely station. The explorers of the late 19th century, such as those on the Belgica expedition to the Antarctic, often used these final lighthouses as their last point of departure from the civilized world. As they sailed south into the unknown, the light at Cape Horn or the Staten Island beacon was the last human-made thing they would see for months, perhaps years. In their journals, they wrote of the fading spark of the light, a poignant symbol of their departure into the wilderness. To them, the lighthouse was more than a navigational aid, it was a memory of home, a final gesture of connection to the world they were leaving behind. The technical specifications of the lamps themselves were a source of constant innovation. From the early Argand lamps with their circular wicks to the later incandescent oil vapor lamps, the goal was always to produce more light with less fuel. The archival drawings of these burner assemblies are works of art in their own right, intricate diagrams of brass tubes, preheating coils, and delicate silk mantles. They represent a specialized branch of engineering that was both highly advanced and remarkably robust, designed to operate for thousands of hours without failure. The keeper's ability to disassemble, clean, and reassemble these burners in the dark, by touch alone, was a testament to their skill and dedication. In the quiet hours of the morning, when the world is at its most still, the lighthouse continues its work. The light sweeps across the waves, a long, elegant finger of white that touches the foam and the dark, heaving surface of the sea. It is a sight that has remained unchanged for centuries, a constant in a world of flux. The ships come and go, the seasons turn, and the empires rise and fall, but the light remains, a steady, unhurried presence on the edge of the world. The archival records of the lighthouse service also tell the story of the families who lived in these remote outposts. The children of the keepers often grew up with the rhythm of the light as their primary clock. They learned to read by the glow of the lamp and played among the rocks and the tide pools. Their education was often provided by their parents, using the small library of books provided by the Lighthouse Board. The census records for these stations show a surprising number of people living in these isolated spots: keepers, wives, children, and sometimes an assistant keeper, all forming a tiny, self-contained community that existed on the very fringe of society. The stories of these families are found in the small, personal artifacts preserved in maritime museums: a hand-carved wooden toy, a piece of embroidery depicting the lighthouse, a collection of pressed sea moss. These items speak of a life lived with patience and resilience, a life that found beauty in the simple and the everyday. They remind us that the history of the sea is not just a history of ships and explorers, but also a history of those who stayed behind, who kept the lights burning and the watches steady, ensuring that the path remained clear for those who ventured into the deep. As we conclude this segment of our Maritime Sleep Chronicle, we are left with the image of the light, burning bright and steady against the vast, dark expanse of the South Atlantic. It is an image of profound peace and continuity, a reminder of the enduring power of human effort and the quiet strength of the lighthouse. The night is long, and the sea is vast, but the light is constant, a beacon of hope and a guide for all who travel the timeless voyages of the world. The rhythmic pulse of the light is mirrored in the steady breathing of the sea, a slow, deep inhalation and exhalation that has continued for eons. In the silence of the archival room, we can almost hear the sound of the waves against the base of the tower, a soft, percussive thud that marks the passage of time. The ledgers are closed, the ink is dry, and the stories of the keepers and the explorers are woven into the fabric of the night. We rest in the knowledge that the lights are still burning, the watches are still being kept, and the sea is still being guided by the steady, unblinking eyes of the lighthouses. The transition from the fifth to the sixth segment of our journey will be as gentle as the turning of a tide. We will move from the rugged coasts of the South Atlantic to the coral-fringed islands of the Pacific, continuing our exploration of the distant lighthouses and the timeless voyages that define our maritime history. But for now, we linger in the quiet glow of the Atlantic beacons, letting the rhythm of the light and the sea lead us into a deep and peaceful sleep. The colza oil, once the lifeblood of the great lenses, left a faint, sweet scent in the air of the lantern room, a scent that symbolized the warmth and the safety of the station. The brass wicks, the polished glass, and the heavy iron weights all played their part in the grand machinery of the light. And the keeper, sitting in his wooden chair, watching the horizon, was the final link in the chain, the human heart of the lighthouse. His watch was a long one, but it was a watch filled with a quiet dignity and a profound sense of purpose. As the stars fade and the first light of dawn begins to touch the eastern sky, we leave him there, a silent sentinel on the edge of the world, and we drift further into the calm, archival depths of our maritime history. The South Atlantic stations, from the Cape of Good Hope to the shores of Patagonia, remain as they have always been, symbols of endurance and reliability. Their history is a history of the long view, of the patient accumulation of data and the steady maintenance of the light. It is a history that invites us to slow down, to breathe deeply, and to appreciate the quiet continuity of the maritime world. In the archives of the sea, there is a place for every light, every ship, and every keeper, all recorded with a dry, unwavering precision that honors their contribution to the safety of the world's oceans. As the night progresses, the images of the lighthouses, the limestone towers, the cast iron plates, the granite blocks, all merge into a single, calming presence. They are the landmarks of our journey, the fixed points in an ever-changing landscape. We follow their light across the water, feeling the gentle movement of the ship and the cool, salt-laden air on our skin. The world of the lighthouse is a world of order and rhythm, a world where the darkness is not something to be feared, but something to be illuminated, one flash at a time. And so, we continue our voyage, guided by the stars and the beacons, as we drift deeper into the timeless, archival sleep of the maritime chronicles. The shift in the watch at the south pillar occurs without the intervention of a clock, governed instead by the slow, rhythmic accumulation of sand in a glass and the predictable cooling of the lantern room's iron floor. We find ourselves now in the late autumn of 1858, observing the long, grey transitions of the North Atlantic, where the sea does not so much move as it heaves in a singular, unified breath. The logs of the commissioners of northern lighthouses remain our primary guide here, their pages brittle and smelling faintly of dried kelp and stagnant ink. In these ledgers, the life of a lightkeeper is reduced to a series of vertical columns, the consumption of colza oil measured in gills, the duration of the fog signal, and the daily temperature of the oil cellar. There is a profound stillness in this bureaucracy of light, a sense that the safety of the entire merchant fleet rests not upon grand gestures, but upon the meticulous trimming of a wick and the soft, repetitive polishing of a silvered reflector. To look upon the lens of a first-order Fresnel apparatus is to see the geometry of human patience. It is a hive of glass, a silent, rotating cathedral of concentric prisms designed by Augustine Fresnel to capture the erratic flickers of a flame and bind them into a solid, unyielding beam. In the quiet of the watch, the only sound is the clockwork mechanism, a steady, heavy thrum of brass gears and lead weights descending slowly through the central shaft of the tower, a mechanical heartbeat that ensures the light rotates with the precision of the stars themselves. As we move further south in our archival survey, we encounter the journals of the HMS Beagle, not during the more famous voyages of its later years, but in the quiet, formative hydrographic surveys of the 1820s. Captain Pringle Stokes and later Robert Fitzroy were men possessed by the silence of the charts. They moved through the labyrinthine channels of Tierra del Fuego with a slowness that is difficult for the modern mind to inhabit. The vessel would remain at anchor for days in a nameless cove, the only activity being the lowering of the lead line to measure the depth of the silted floor. One can almost hear the soft splash of the tallow-armed lead hitting the water, and the subsequent call of the leadsman, a rhythmic chant that marked the hidden contours of the world beneath the hull. The provisioning lists for such voyages are long and rhythmic in their repetition: tisses of salted beef, bags of hardtack that had to be tapped against the table to dislodge the weevils, and the constant, preventative presence of lime juice. The air in the lower decks was thick with the scent of damp wool, seasoned oak, and the metallic tang of the chronometers, which were kept in padded boxes as if they were delicate, sleeping deities upon whose accuracy the lives of 50 men depended. There was no urgency in these surveys, only the steady, incremental accumulation of data, the height of a cliff, the direction of a current, the specific shade of green of the coastal moss, all recorded in a fine, cursive hand that remained steady even as the ship rolled in the heavy swells of the Southern Ocean. The lighthouses of the Mediterranean offer a different quality of silence, one steeped in the heat of the afternoon and the scent of parched stone. In the mid-19th century, the Pharos of Alexandria had long passed into the realm of archaeological memory, replaced by the more modest but no less vital beacons of the Ottoman and British administrations. At the iron screw pile light of the Royal Shoal, the water is so clear that the shadow of the structure rests upon the seabed like a ghost. Here, the keepers dealt not with the sleet of the north, but with the relentless glare of the sun on the salt-crusted galleries. Their journals speak of the cooling properties of stone floors and the way the light changed as the Khamsin wind blew red dust across the sea from the interior. The transition from the day mark to the evening watch was a slow dissolution of color, as the turquoise water turned to indigo and then to a velvet blackness that seemed to swallow the very horizon. The preparation of the lamp was a ritual of quietude. The glass chimneys were wiped with chamois leather until they were invisible, and the heavy brass reservoir was filled with oil that flowed with the viscosity of honey. There is a specific peace in the act of lighting a lamp at sea, the strike of a match, the slow rise of the flame, and the moment the light catches the first prism of the lens, casting a long, golden finger across the darkening waves. In the archives of the Dutch East India Company, we find the records of the Indiaman, those heavy, high-pooped vessels that lumbered across the Indian Ocean toward the spice ports of Batavia. These were voyages that lasted seasons rather than weeks. The ships were floating villages, carrying within their timbered ribs the scent of nutmeg, cloves, and the heavy, earthy aroma of the tea chests. The navigation was a matter of celestial patience. A navigator would stand upon the quarterdeck with a sextant, waiting for a break in the clouds to catch the sun at its zenith. The calculations that followed were performed in a silence broken only by the creaking of the masts and the sighing of the wind in the rigging. The charts of this era were beautiful, hand-washed maps where the land was often a suggestion and the sea was filled with the names of forgotten wrecks. To travel in such a way was to be untethered from the world of the shore, to exist in a state of perpetual transit where the only constants were the rising and setting of the sun and the steady, rhythmic wash of the sea against the hull. The crew's routine was a cycle of 4-hour watches, a cadence that dictated sleep and wakefulness in a manner that ignored the conventions of the day. A sailor might wake in the middle of a moonlit night to find the ship ghosting through a sea of bioluminescence, the water glowing with a cold, green fire that illuminated the bellies of the sails and the faces of the men on deck. The Corduan Lighthouse, standing at the mouth of the Gironde estuary, represents perhaps the most ornate expression of this maritime stillness. Built as a monument to the kings of France, its interior was lined with marble and featured a regal apartment for the monarch, though no king ever spent the night there. The keepers, however, lived within its circular walls for decades, their lives governed by the rise and fall of the tides that isolated the tower from the mainland. The archival records of Corduan describe the meticulous care of the parabolic reflectors before the installation of the Fresnel lens in 1823. Each reflector had to be polished with a mixture of fine rouge and spirits of wine, a task that required hundreds of hours of gentle, circular motion. The sound of the cloth against the silver was a soft, rhythmic hiss, a whisper that echoed in the vaulted chambers of the tower. During the long winter nights, the wind would howl through the gallery railings, but inside the thick stone walls, the air remained still, smelling of beeswax and the faint, sweet scent of the oil lamps. The keepers would sit by the small coal stove in their quarters, the light of a single candle casting long shadows against the curved walls, while above them, the great light turned on its chariot of rollers, a silent guardian of the estuary. We turn our attention now to the journals of the Arctic explorers, specifically the logs of the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror during their early, successful voyages to the Antarctic under James Clark Ross. Before the tragedy of the Franklin expedition, these ships were sanctuaries of scientific inquiry. The magnetical observations were conducted with a quietude that bordered on the religious. In the ice-choked waters of the Ross Sea, the ships would be moored to the floes, and the officers would step out onto the frozen surface with their delicate brass instruments. The air was so cold and still that a man's breath would hang in the air for minutes, a white cloud in the crystalline light. The records detail the specific gravity of the sea water, the temperature of the ice at various depths, and the movements of the magnetic needle. There is a profound sense of isolation in these pages, a realization that these men were further from their homes than any humans had ever been, surrounded by a landscape of white and blue that stretched infinitely toward the pole. The provisioning of these ships was a masterpiece of Victorian logistics, thousands of pounds of concentrated soup, tins of preserved meats, and mountains of chocolate. In the evenings, the officers would gather in the wardroom to read by the light of whale oil lamps, the silence of the Antarctic night pressing in against the thick, reinforced timbers of the hull. The ships were their entire world, a small, warm pocket of Victorian England drifting through a sea of ice. The transition from sail to steam in the mid-19th century did not immediately shatter this maritime calm. Early steamships, like the Great Western or the British Queen, were still rigged for sail and moved with a hybrid grace. The archival records of the Cunard Line describe the early Atlantic crossings as exercises in endurance and quietude. The engines were slow, rhythmic beasts that beat with a steady, low-frequency throb, a sound that eventually became as natural to the passengers as the sound of the sea itself. The coal was shoveled by hand in the stokehold, a world of shadows and orange light far below the water line, while on deck, the passengers wrapped themselves in heavy rugs and watched the endless grey horizon of the North Atlantic. The logs of these early steamers record the sightings of icebergs, great, silent cathedrals of ice that drifted south from the Labrador Current. The lookout in the crow's nest would watch for the ice blink, a pale glow on the horizon that signaled the presence of these frozen giants. The navigation was a constant dialogue between the magnetic compass and the churning of the paddle wheels, a slow, deliberate progress toward the distant lights of the Irish coast. Returning to the lighthouses, we consider the lonely station of the Eddystone, a tower that has been rebuilt 4 times on a treacherous reef off the coast of Devon. The Smeaton Tower, which stood for over a century, was a triumph of interlocking stonework, designed to mimic the trunk of an oak tree. The keeper's journals from the 1840s describe the sensation of the tower vibrating during a storm, a low, resonant hum that could be felt in the teeth. Yet, within this vibration, there was a sense of absolute security. The masonry was so dense that the sound of the waves was muffled, reduced to a rhythmic thudding like the beating of a distant drum. The routine of the Eddystone was a masterpiece of domestic order in a chaotic environment. Every copper kettle was polished, every floorboard scrubbed with sand, and every entry in the logbook written in a hand that betrayed no hint of the gale raging outside. The keepers would spend their off-duty hours at small crafts, carving model ships from bone, knitting heavy wool sweaters, or reading the Bible by the steady light of a tallow candle. There was no room for restlessness in a space so confined. One had to embrace the slow passage of time and the cyclical nature of the light. The hydrographic surveys of the Pacific in the late 19th century bring us to the work of the HMS Challenger. This was a voyage not of conquest, but of deep-sea exploration, a 4-year odyssey to map the floor of the ocean. The archival records of the Challenger are vast, filled with drawings of microscopic radiolarians and maps of the deep-sea basins. The ship moved with a deliberate slowness, stopping every few hundred miles to lower a dredge or a sounding line into the abyss. The process of deep-sea sounding was an exercise in extreme patience. It could take hours for the heavy lead to reach the bottom, miles below the surface, and even longer for the steam winch to haul the line back up. The crew would gather at the rail to watch the line come in, waiting for the first glimpse of the samples from the seafloor, shimmering ooze, strange volcanic stones, or the delicate shells of creatures that had never seen the sun. The silence of the Pacific was absolute, a vast, blue emptiness that stretched from horizon to horizon. The Challenger was a floating laboratory, its decks crowded with jars of alcohol, brass microscopes, and reams of parchment. The scientists would work long into the night, their movement slow and methodical, as they catalogued the secrets of a world that had remained hidden since the beginning of time. In the late 19th century, the Lighthouse service in America saw the rise of the Wickies, the dedicated keepers of the lights along the rugged coast of Maine and the Outer Banks. At the light of Cape Hatteras, the tallest brick lighthouse in the country, the keeper's climb was a daily pilgrimage. 268 steps spiraled upward through the cool, dark interior of the tower. The archives of the Lighthouse Board contain the precise instructions for the maintenance of the first-order Fresnel lens, the use of linen cloths for the glass, the specific grade of oil for the lamp, and the requirement that the keeper remain in the watchroom from sunset to sunrise. The life of a Hatteras keeper was one of constant vigilance against the encroaching sand and the relentless salt spray. The ledger books record the arrival of the supply tenders, ships like the Iris or the Maple, which brought the barrels of oil, the bags of coal, and the mail that connected the keepers to the world beyond the dunes. There is a quiet dignity in these records, a sense of a life lived in service to a singular, luminous purpose. The light was not just a beacon for ships, it was a constant, pulsing presence in the lives of the families who lived in its shadow, a rhythmic flicker that could be seen through the windows of their cottages, a reassurance that the world was still in its proper order. As we reach the later years of the 19th century, we find the records of the great sailing ships of the nitrate trade, the P-liners of the Layas line. These were the last of the great windjammers, steel-hulled giants that rounded Cape Horn with cargoes of fertilizer from the Chilean coast. The logs of ships like the Potosi or the Prussian describe a world of extreme scale and silent power. These vessels were so large that the sound of the wind in their rigging was like the roar of a waterfall. Yet, on the quiet days in the doldrums, they would sit motionless on a sea of glass, their reflection so perfect that the ship seemed to be suspended in the sky. The crew would work in a state of rhythmic grace, moving aloft to furl the giant sails with a coordinated effort that required no words. The archival photographs of these ships show men balanced precariously on foot ropes hundreds of feet above the deck, their figures silhouetted against a backdrop of clouds. The provisioning for a Cape Horn voyage was a matter of survival: salt pork, dried peas, and the chicraca hash made from crushed biscuits and fat. The transition through the latitudes was marked by the changing temperature of the air and the shifting constellations of the night sky. To round the Horn was to enter a realm where time seemed to slow down, where the only reality was the movement of the ship and the vast, unfeeling power of the Southern Ocean. The archival records of the lightships offer a unique perspective on maritime stillness. These were vessels that did not travel. They were anchored in one place for months or years at a time, marking dangerous shoals where no stone tower could be built. At the Nantucket Shoals lightship, the crew lived in a state of suspended animation. The vessel would pitch and roll in the heavy swells, but its position on the chart remained unchanged. The journals of the lightship men speak of the relentless sound of the fog siren, a deep, mournful groan that would repeat every 30 seconds for days on end when the mist rolled in from the Atlantic. Yet, within this sound, the men found a rhythm for their lives. They would paint the ship, mend the nets, and fish over the side, the sea providing a constant, shifting scenery for their stationary existence. The lightship was a lonely outpost of civilization, its masthead light a solitary star in the darkness of the shoals. The supply tenders would visit once a month, bringing fresh water and news from the shore, but for the most part, the men of the lightship lived in a world of their own, a world defined by the length of their anchor chain and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the beacon above their heads. In the quiet of the maritime archives, we find the records of the tea clippers, those elegant, narrow-hulled vessels that raced from China to London in the 1860s. While the race suggests a frantic pace, the reality of the voyage was one of long, silent stretches across the Indian Ocean. The journals of the captains of ships like the Cutty Sark or the Thermopylae describe the intense focus required to trim the sails to the lightest of breezes. Every sheet and halyard was adjusted with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. The scent of the tea in the hold was a constant presence, a dry, herbal aroma that permeated the entire ship. The logs record the daily progress in miles, the weather conditions, and the sightings of other vessels on the horizon. There was a profound quietude in the way these ships moved through the water, their sharp bows cutting the waves with a minimal of fuss. The officers would spend hours on the poop deck, their eyes scanning the horizon for the first sign of a change in the wind. The transition from the trade winds to the horse latitudes was a period of profound stillness, when the ship would sit motionless for days, its sails hanging limp and the sea a flat, shimmering mirror. The lighthouses of the Great Lakes, such as the Stannard Rock Light in Lake Superior, represent a different kind of isolation. Known as the loneliest place in the world, this tower was built on a reef 45 miles from the nearest land. The archives of the U.S. Lighthouse Service describe the construction of the light as a feat of monumental endurance. The stone was quarried on the mainland and transported by barge to the reef, where it was laid by men who lived in temporary wooden barracks bolted to the rock. The winter records of Stannard Rock are particularly striking. The spray from the lake would freeze upon the tower, encasing it in a layer of ice several feet thick. The keepers would have to hack their way out of the door with axes just to reach the lantern room. The journals speak of the absolute silence of the frozen lake, a silence so deep that the sound of a cracking ice floe miles away could be heard as clearly as a gunshot. Inside the tower, the air was kept warm by a small coal stove, and the keepers would pass the long winter months in a state of quiet contemplation, their lives governed by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clockwork and the white, frozen world outside their windows. As we conclude this segment of our archival journey, we return to the image of the lighthouse ledger. It is a record of a world that moved at the speed of a sailing ship and the rotation of a lens. The names of the vessels, the Morning Star, the Wanderer, the Sea Witch, are written in a hand that is both precise and weary. The entries for oil consumption and weather conditions are a testament to the quiet, unhurried nature of maritime history. There is no drama here, only the steady accumulation of days and nights, the rhythmic shift of the watches, and the constant, unwavering presence of the light. The sea remains as it has always been, a vast, silent expanse that both connects and divides us. And the lighthouses, whether standing on a granite reef or a sandy spit, continue their silent vigil, their beams cutting through the darkness in a rhythmic, timeless dance. We leave the archives now, the scent of old paper and whale oil lingering in the air, and move toward the final transitions of the night, where the history of the sea becomes a part of the silence of sleep. The light from the lantern room at Bishop Rock, situated at the westernmost fringe of the Isles of Scilly, does not so much flash as it breathes, a rhythmic pulse of white light that has defined the boundary between the vast, undulating Atlantic and the rocky approaches to the English Channel for over a century and a half. To consider the history of this particular station is to consider the patient, iterative nature of Victorian engineering, an era where the struggle against the sea was documented not in outbursts of drama, but in the meticulous ledgers of the Trinity House Corporation and the steady, ink-stained entries of the Clerk of Works. It is late now, in the chronology of our journey, and the air of the historical record is thick with the scent of salt-crusted granite and the slow, methodical ticking of the rotation machinery. In the year 1847, the first attempt to mark this treacherous pinnacle, a rock so small it is entirely submerged at high spring tides, began not with stone, but with iron. Nicholas Douglas, a name synonymous with the stoic persistence of lighthouse builders, envisioned a structure of wrought iron screw piles, slender legs that would allow the heavy seas to pass through the framework rather than breaking against a solid face. We might imagine the quiet sound of hammers against metal in the rare moments of calm, the men working from a temporary dwelling perched atop the skeletal frame. For 3 years, the work proceeded with a deliberate, unhurried pace, the ironwork slowly rising from the dark Atlantic swell. Yet, in early 1850, before the lantern could be lit, a storm of unusual duration swept across the western approaches. When the mist cleared, the ledger noted with archival detachment that the entire structure had been swept away, leaving nothing but the bare, indifferent rock. This failure did not lead to haste, but rather to a more profound stillness of purpose. The decision was made to build in granite, a material that reflects the permanence of the sea itself. The stones were quarried at Aberdeen, each one shaped with such precision that they functioned as a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, dovetailing into one another to ensure that no single block could be dislodged without the movement of the entire mass. We find in the records of the time a preoccupation with the weight of these stones, some over 2 tons, and the slow journey they took by barge and sailing vessel to the staging area at St. Mary's. The process of landing these stones upon the rock was a ballet of heavy timber and hemp rope, dictated entirely by the rhythm of the tides and the swell. A single stone might wait weeks in the hold of a tender, the crew watching the barometer and the color of the horizon, waiting for that specific, silent window of tranquility required to swing the granite into place. By 1858, the first stone tower was completed, standing 110 feet tall. Inside, the world of the keepers was one of verticality and polished brass. The inventory of the Bishop Rock at this time reveals the quiet domesticity of the service, the weight of the colza oil stored in the lower tanks, the number of spare wicks kept in tin boxes, the precise volume of fresh water held in the slate cisterns, and the slow, repetitive task of cleaning the glass of the great 4-wick burner. The keepers lived within walls that were 7 feet thick at the base, a silence so profound that the only sound was the muffled thud of the sea far below and the mechanical hum of the clockwork that drove the heavy glass lenses in their circular path. As the 19th century progressed into its twilight years, the demands of global trade and the increasing speed of the great Atlantic liners necessitated a more powerful signal. The tower was not replaced, but encased. In 1881, Sir James Douglas, son of Nicholas, began the extraordinary task of thickening the existing tower and raising its height. It was a renovation conducted in the slow, rhythmic pace of a cathedral's construction. Each new layer of granite was bolted to the old, a process of reinforcement that mirrored the layering of time itself. The lighthouse became a monument to stability, eventually standing 167 feet above the high-water mark, crowned with a magnificent biform oil wick lamp and a double tier of Fresnel lenses. These lenses, masterpieces of optical glass, captured the flickering flame and organized it into concentrated beams that could be seen for 18 nautical miles, a silent guide for vessels like the Great Eastern or the early Cunardas as they sought the safety of the channel. The logs kept by the keepers during these decades are masterpieces of understated observation. They recorded the arrival of the relief boat, the condition of the paintwork, and the migration of birds that sometimes fluttered against the lantern glass like moths. They noted the barometric pressure in elegant, looping script, marking the passage of depressions with the same clinical calm as they noted the delivery of a new crate of hardtack or a barrel of salted pork. There is a specific quality to the silence of a lighthouse log. It is the silence of a task that is never finished, a vigil that transcends the individual life of the keeper. Turning our gaze from the granite of the Scillies toward the southern latitudes, we find the same spirit of methodical endurance in the records of the late Victorian explorers who sought to map the final frontiers of the maritime world. Consider the voyage of the Belgica in 1897, under the command of Adrian de Gerlache. This was not a voyage of conquest, but one of scientific observation, a slow drifting through the ice of the Antarctic. The vessel itself, a former whaler, was reinforced with greenheart timber to withstand the pressure of the floes. As the Belgica became the first vessel to overwinter in the Antarctic ice, the narrative of the expedition shifted from movement to stasis. The journals of the men on board, including a young Roald Amundsen and the physician Frederick Cook, describe a world where time seemed to thicken and slow. They recorded the precise temperature of the sea water at various depths, the salinity of the ice, and the subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field. During a long polar night, the ship became a floating laboratory, a small pocket of warmth and lamplight in an infinite expanse of white and violet shadow. The crew occupied themselves with the maintenance of the ship's instruments, the repair of their wool and fur clothing, and the endless task of melting ice for fresh water. The sound of the ice pressing against the hull was a constant, low-frequency groan, a reminder of the immense, slow-moving forces of the Southern Ocean. They lived on a diet of tinned meats and, eventually, fresh penguin and seal, a necessity recorded in the medical logs with a sense of clinical pragmatism. The voyage of the Belgica was a testament to the fact that exploration is often less about the thrill of discovery and more about the capacity of the human spirit to endure long periods of quietude and isolation. This same capacity for endurance is found in the hydrographic surveys of the Pacific, conducted by vessels like HMS Challenger during its 4-year circumnavigation from 1872 to 1876. The Challenger was a corvette stripped of her guns to make room for laboratories, spirit jars, and miles of sounding line. The mission was to map the floor of the deep ocean, a task that required the ship to come to a complete halt every few days. The process of taking a deep-sea sounding in the 1870s was an exercise in extreme patience. A heavy lead weight was attached to a hempen line and lowered into the abyss, sometimes taking hours to reach the bottom miles below. The sailors and scientists would wait, the ship drifting slightly in the swells, as the line unspooled with a rhythmic click of the winch. The samples brought up from the seabed, the Globigerina ooze, the cold, dark clays of the deep, were carefully bottled and labeled, forming the basis of our modern understanding of the ocean's depths. The Challenger's reports, eventually filling 50 massive volumes, are a monument to the slow accumulation of knowledge. They contain detailed lithographs of microscopic radiolaria and meticulously plotted charts of underwater mountain ranges that no human eye would ever see. The voyage was a long, quiet conversation with the hidden world beneath the waves, a journey where the distance traveled was measured not just in leagues across the surface, but in fathoms toward the center of the Earth. As we move through the archival records of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we find a consistent thread of quietude in the way the sea was managed and understood. The development of the telegraph and the laying of the first transatlantic cables introduced a new kind of maritime history, one of submerged copper wires and the ships that tended them. Vessels like the Faraday, designed specifically for cable laying, moved across the ocean at a walking pace, paying out the heavy, gutta-percha-insulated wire over the stern. The work was delicate and unhurried. A kink in the cable or a sudden change in the seabed topography could ruin months of preparation. The cable ships were islands of intense, focused calm, their decks crowded with massive coils of wire that looked, in the moonlight, like the sleeping coils of a great sea serpent. In the coastal stations, the transition from oil to electricity was beginning to be discussed in the circulars of the lighthouse boards, yet the daily routine remained unchanged. At the Eddystone, the Longships, and the Wolf Rock, the keepers continued to wind the clockwork, to trim the wicks, and to polish the brass. The introduction of the fog signal, the great, booming sirens and reed horns, added a new sonic dimension to the maritime landscape. These signals, powered by compressed air or steam, were designed to speak when the light could not. The logs record the hours of fog, the thick weather that would descend for days, wrapping the lighthouse in a damp, grey blanket. In these times, the keeper's world was defined by the rhythmic blast of the horn, a sound that vibrated through the very granite of the tower, and the constant monitoring of the pressure gauges. The provisioning of these distant stations remained a logistical feat of quiet precision. The annual or quarterly arrival of the tender brought not just coal and oil, but boxes of books from the lighthouse libraries, revolving collections of history, biography, and fiction designed to sustain the minds of men living in isolation. The inventory of a lighthouse library in 1890 might include volumes on the history of the Levant, the flora of the British Isles, and the collected works of poets who found beauty in the melancholy of the coast. These books, their pages often softened by the damp air, were passed from station to station, a slow-moving current of thought that mirrored the movement of the tides. On the far side of the world, the lighthouses of the Australian coast, such as the one at Cape Otway or the isolated tower on Matsuka Island, stood as lonely sentinels over the Southern Ocean. Matsuka, the most southerly lighthouse in Australia, was a place of extreme isolation, where the wind, known as the Roaring Forties, blew with such consistency that the very trees grew horizontally. The keepers there were weather observers for a continent, recording the passage of storms that would not reach the mainland for days. Their life was one of self-sufficiency. They tended vegetable gardens in the lee of the stone walls and kept goats for milk, their existence tied to the arrival of the supply ship that struggled against the heavy swells of the Great Australian Bight. The history of these voyages and stations is not found in the headlines of the day, but in the margins of the ledgers. It is found in the record of a new coat of red lead paint applied to a buoy, the replacement of a cracked pane of glass in a lantern room, or the successful calibration of a sextant by a navigator on a T-clipper. It is a history of maintenance, of the quiet effort required to keep the world's trade routes open and its sailors safe. The sea, in its vastness, demands a certain kind of humility, a recognition that the work of the explorer and the lighthouse builder is never truly finished, but merely handed down from one generation to the next. Consider the voyage of the Discovery in 1901. as it carried Robert Falcon Scott toward the Ross Sea. The ship was built of oak and elm, with a hull of extraordinary thickness to resist the ice. The records of the expedition's early months are filled with the details of stowage, the packing of thousands of pounds of biscuit, the securing of the scientific instruments, and the slow, heavy progress through the pack ice. There is a sense of profound stillness in the descriptions of the Antarctic summer, where the sun circles the horizon but never sets, and the only sound is the occasional crack of the ice or the distant blow of a whale. The Discovery, frozen into the ice of McMurdo Sound for 2 years, became a stationary outpost of Edwardian society, with its own newspaper, its own theatrical productions, and its constant, meticulous recording of the natural world. The scientific logs of the Discovery are a marvel of detail. They record the behavior of the magnetic needle, the movements of the tides under the ice, and the classification of every creature brought up from the freezing depths. This was the era of the heroic age of exploration, yet the reality for the men on board was often one of routine and the slow passage of time. They spent hours measuring the growth of ice crystals and documenting the subtle shifts in the color of the sky. Their voyage was a long, cold meditation on the nature of the southern continent, a journey that required a steady hand and a quiet mind. Returning to the Northern Hemisphere, we find the same dedication in the work of the United States Lighthouse Service, particularly in the remote stations of the Pacific Northwest. At Tillamook Rock, a jagged tooth of basalt rising from the sea off the coast of Oregon, the construction of the lighthouse was an ordeal of wind and spray. The rock was so steep and the sea so violent that men and materials had to be hoisted to the summit in a breeches buoy, a canvas seat suspended from a cable. The keepers who lived there, often for months at a time without relief, spoke of the terrible Tillio not with fear, but with a weary respect. They recorded the waves that would occasionally break over the top of the lantern room, 130 feet above the sea, and the stones that were sometimes hurled through the glass by the force of the Atlantic. Their logs are a record of constant repair, the sealing of leaks, the repainting of the ironwork, and the steady, unhurried maintenance of the first-order Fresnel lens that sent its beam across the dark, cold waters of the Pacific. The Fresnel lens itself is a symbol of this era's maritime history. Developed in the 1820s by Augustine Jean Fresnel, these lenses were works of high art and precise science. A first-order lens, the largest of its kind, could stand over 10 feet tall and contain hundreds of individual prisms, each one hand-ground and polished to a mirror finish. The assembly of such a lens in a remote lighthouse was a task of extreme delicacy, requiring the use of fine oils and soft cloths to ensure that no scratch marred the surface of the glass. The light produced by these lenses was not a harsh glare, but a soft, penetrating glow that seemed to hold the darkness at bay through sheer clarity. To sit in a lantern room at night was to be at the center of a slow-turning world of light and shadow, the prisms catching the flame and casting it out in long, silent fingers across the water. In the early 20th century, the world of the sail was slowly giving way to the world of the steamship, yet the fundamental realities of the sea remained. The great liners, the Mauretania and the Olympic, moved with a grace and power that seemed to defy the elements, yet they still relied on the same charts, the same lighthouses, and the same celestial observations that had guided the navigators of the previous century. The transition was documented in the harbor ledgers and the shipping news, noting the arrival of coal burners and the gradual disappearance of the tall ships. Yet, in the quiet corners of the maritime world, in the distant lighthouses and the slow-moving research vessels, the old ways persisted. The records of the meteorological stations, often located at lighthouses, provide a continuous narrative of the Earth's atmosphere. The keepers would step out onto the gallery every few hours, regardless of the weather, to read the thermometers and the anemometers. They would look at the clouds, the cirrus, the cumulus, the dark nimbus of an approaching front, and record their observations in the weather book. These records, spanning decades, form a quiet, rhythmic history of the planet's breath, a testament to the patient observation of men who lived at the edge of the world. As we dwell on these archival details, the mind naturally drifts toward the continuity of the sea. The same waves that broke against the Bishop Rock in 1858 break against it tonight. The same stars that guided the Challenger across the Pacific still hang in the sky, reflected in the dark, undulating surface of the water. The history of the sea is not a series of events, but a single, unfolding process, a long voyage that has no beginning and no end. The logs of the Lighthouse service and the journals of the explorers are more than just records of fact, they are a form of maritime liturgy, a repetition of tasks and observations that ground the human experience in the vastness of the natural world. They speak of the weight of the whale oil, the clarity of the glass, the strength of the granite, and the steady pulse of the light. They tell us that even in the most remote and desolate places, there is a sense of order and purpose. In the quiet of the night, we can almost hear the scratch of a nib against paper in a lighthouse far out at sea, as a keeper records the state of the tide and the direction of the wind. We can imagine the slow rotation of the great lens, the brass gears clicking softly in the warmth of the lantern room. We can see the distant light of a passing ship, a small, steady spark on the horizon, moving slowly toward its destination. This is the maritime world in its most essential form, a place of quiet vigil, of methodical exploration, and of timeless voyages that continue long after the sun has set. The damp wool of a keeper's coat, the scent of the oil lamp, the cold touch of the brass sextant, the rhythmic sound of the surf against the base of the tower, these are the sensory anchors of our history. They remind us of the physicality of the maritime past, of the work that was done by hand and by heart. As we move closer to the end of our journey, the details become more precious, the silence more profound. The history of the lighthouses and the explorers is a history of the light that we carry into the darkness, a light that is steady, unhurried, and enduring. The transition from one watch to the next, the changing of the guard at the edge of the ocean, is a moment of profound continuity. The outgoing keeper hands over the log, the incoming keeper checks the oil levels, and the vigil continues. It is a cycle as old as the sea itself, a testament to the human desire to mark the way, to map the unknown, and to find our way home through the long, quiet reaches of the night. The archives are full of such moments, recorded with a simplicity that belies their significance. They are the heartbeat of the maritime world, a slow, steady pulse that guides us through the history of the waves and the wind. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the maps of the world's oceans were largely complete, yet the depths remained a mystery. The work of the sounding lines and the dredges continued, slowly revealing the contours of the sea floor. The great mountain ranges of the Atlantic, the deep trenches of the Pacific, the vast plains of the Indian Ocean, all were being brought into the light of human understanding, one sounding at a time. This was a voyage of the mind as much as the body, a slow expansion of the known world that required the same patience and dedication as the building of a lighthouse on a submerged rock. The lighthouses themselves began to evolve, with the introduction of incandescent oil vapor lamps, which provided a much brighter light with less fuel. The machinery became more sophisticated, with mercury baths allowing the massive lenses to rotate with almost no friction, turned by a weight that descended slowly through the center of the tower. These technical improvements were recorded in the engineering reports with a sense of quiet pride, a recognition that the struggle against the darkness was being won through the application of reason and skill. Yet, despite the advances in technology, the essence of the lighthouse remained the same. It was a place of isolation and responsibility, a vertical world where the primary duty was to maintain a light. The keepers continued to live by the rhythm of the sun and the moon, their lives shaped by the requirements of the service. They were the custodians of the coast, the silent partners of every sailor who moved across the water. Their history is a history of the small, the quiet, and the enduring, the steady flame in the window of the world. The archival record of these lives is a gift of stillness. It invites us to slow down, to listen to the sound of the sea, and to appreciate the beauty of a task well done. It tells us that the most important work is often that which is done in the shadows, far from the gaze of the world. The distant lighthouses, the famous explorers, and the timeless voyages are all parts of a single, unfolding story, a story of the human spirit's encounter with the vast, indifferent beauty of the ocean. As we conclude this segment of our journey, we find ourselves back at the edge of the water, looking out toward the horizon. The light from the Bishop Rock continues to breathe, a rhythmic pulse that has seen the passing of generations. The records of the past are safe in their ledgers, and the sea continues its slow, eternal movement. The darkness is not something to be feared, but a space of quietude and reflection, a place where the history of the maritime world is written in the stars and the spray. The journey continues, unhurried and calm, through the vast, silent reaches of the maritime night. The steady rotation of the light continues, a rhythmic pulse of white brilliance that has defined the night watches on this stretch of the coastline for over 140 years. We find ourselves now in the final hours of the watch, that period between the deepest immersion of the stars and the first, almost imperceptible grey of the eastern horizon. It is a time of profound stillness in the archival record, a moment where the ink in the logbook seems to have flowed with a slower, more deliberate gravity. To look upon the final pages of a lighthouse keeper's ledger from the late 19th century is to see a life measured not in events, but in intervals. There are the entries for the consumption of oil, the gallons of refined colza or, later, the more volatile mineral oils, and the meticulous notes on the trimming of wicks. In the year 1884, at the height of the season of storms, the head keeper at a station like the lonely Fastnet or the wave-swept Eddystone would have noted the barometric pressure with a precision that bordered on the devotional. The mercury would rise and fall in its glass tube, a silent indicator of the immense atmospheric pressures shifting across the North Atlantic, while inside the lantern room, the temperature remained a constant, humid warmth, smelling of heated brass and the faint, sweet scent of the illuminant. The history of maritime navigation is, at its core, a history of patience and the slow accumulation of geographic certainty. When we consider the voyage of the HMS Beagle, particularly its second survey expedition under Captain Robert Fitzroy, we are observing a masterclass in the unhurried application of Victorian science to the chaos of the southern oceans. The vessel was not merely a ship of discovery, it was a floating laboratory of horology and hydrography. Fitzroy carried no fewer than 22 chronometers, each encased in its own suspended box to isolate it from the heave and pitch of the wooden hull. These clocks were the heartbeat of the expedition, their rhythmic ticking a mechanical counterpoint to the wash of the sea against the copper-sheathed timber. Every few days, when the weather permitted, the officers would take sights with their sextants, bringing the sun or a specific star down to the horizon line with a delicate adjustment of the tangential screw. They were mapping the shape of the world 1 degree of longitude at a time, documenting the intricate fjords of Tierra del Fuego and the desolate, rocky outcrops of the Desolation Islands. Their reports are filled with the names of forgotten coves and the specific gravity of seawater, a dry and beautiful litany of data that slowly filled the voids on the Admiralty charts. The transition from the open sea to the safety of a harbor was guided by the evolution of the Fresnel lens, a marvel of 19th-century glasswork that concentrated the flickering light of a lamp into a singular, piercing beam. To stand before a first-order lens is to witness the intersection of mathematics and art. The prisms, arranged in concentric rings, were ground from crown glass with such exactitude that they could project a signal over 20 nautical miles. Each lighthouse possessed its own unique character, a specific sequence of flashes and eclipses that told the mariner exactly where they stood on the face of the earth. At the Bishop Rock, the westernmost sentinel of the Isles of Scilly, the light would flash twice every 15 seconds, a reliable rhythm that resonated through the fog and the spray. The keepers lived within this rhythm. Their duties were cyclical: the winding of the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens, the polishing of the glass panes to remove the crystalline crust of salt, and the whitewashing of the tower walls. It was a life of verticality, spent ascending and descending the spiral stone stairs, moving between the subterranean oil stores and the celestial height of the gallery. In the late winter of 1892, the logs of the steamship Germanic reflect a passage of unusual density, where the fog clung to the surface of the water for 3 consecutive days. The vessel moved at a reduced speed, the rhythmic thump of the triple expansion engines dampened by the heavy atmosphere. On such nights, the sound of the foghorn, a low, mournful diapason powered by compressed air, would echo back from the unseen cliffs, a sonic map of the coastline. The men on the bridge would stand in silence, their heavy wool coats damp with the mist, listening for the answering bell of a buoy or the distant, rhythmic groan of a whistling buoy anchored over a hidden shoal. This was the era of the great liners, yet the fundamental realities of the sea remained unchanged from the days of the early explorers. The sea demanded a constant, quiet vigilance, a recognition that the safety of the ship depended on the integrity of the charts and the reliability of the lights maintained by men whose names were rarely recorded outside of the payrolls of Trinity House or the United States Lighthouse Board. We think of the great voyages of the past as sequences of grand discoveries, yet the archival reality is one of long, uneventful days spent in the doldrums or the steady trade winds. On the decks of the Endeavour, during James Cook's first voyage, the routine was governed by the ship's bell and the necessity of maintaining the health of the crew. Cook's obsession with cleanliness and the consumption of sauerkraut and maltwort is well documented in his journals, not as a dramatic narrative, but as a series of logistical observations. He noted the state of the rigging, the wear on the sails, and the abundance of fish caught in the evening hours. The voyage was a slow unfolding of the Pacific, a movement through an archipelago of light and water where the primary challenge was the preservation of time and the maintenance of the vessel's structure. The timber, seasoned oak and elm, groaned as it adjusted to the tropical heat, and the caulking required constant attention to keep the hull watertight. It is in these small, repetitive actions, the tapping of a mallet, the tightening of a stay, that the true history of the sea is found. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the technology of the light changed, but the solitude remained. The introduction of the incandescent oil vapor lamp increased the brilliance of the towers, yet the keepers still found themselves in the same stone rooms, reading by the light of a small lamp, their world bounded by the circular walls of the tower and the vast, dark circumference of the sea. They recorded the arrival of migratory birds, which would sometimes flutter against the lantern glass like moths, and the sightings of passing vessels, the stately four-masted barks carrying grain from Australia, or the utilitarian tramps carrying coal to the coaling stations of the Atlantic. Each ship was a silent witness to the continuity of the trade routes, the invisible lines of commerce that connected the distant corners of the empire. The harbour ledgers of ports like Falmouth or New Bedford are filled with the names of these vessels, their tonnage, their cargo of whale oil or timber, and the dates of their arrival and departure, a quiet, numerical poetry of human endeavor. In the archives of the Hydrographic Office, there are charts that have been corrected by hand over decades, with fine red ink marking the discovery of a new rock or the shifting of a sandbank. These charts are the physical manifestation of centuries of collective memory, a palimpsest of maritime experience. They show the soundings taken by lead and line, where a sailor would drop a weighted cord into the depths, feeling for the moment it touched the seabed. The lead was often armed with a piece of tallow in a hollow at its base, which would bring up a sample of the bottom, fine grey sand, broken shells, or soft mud. This information was as vital as the light from a tower, for it allowed the captain to know his position even in total darkness, by comparing the nature of the seabed with the descriptions on his chart. It was a tactile form of navigation, a physical connection between the ship and the hidden landscape beneath the waves. The night is now at its thinnest point. The stars have begun to pale, and the great lens in the lighthouse continues its final revolutions before the dawn. The mechanism, a complex arrangement of steel rollers and bronze gears, moves with a silent fluidity, bathed in the oil that ensures its longevity. The keeper on watch prepares to extinguish the lamp, a process that requires a steady hand to avoid damaging the delicate silk mantles. He will then draw the heavy linen curtains around the interior of the lantern room to protect the glass prisms from the magnifying heat of the morning sun. This final act of the watch is one of closure and preparation, a transition from the world of the light to the world of the day. The history of the sea is not a history of endings, but of cycles, the return of the tide, the rotation of the light, and the steady, unhurried passage of ships across the horizon. As we conclude this chronicle, we leave the coast in the care of its silent sentinels. The ledgers are closed, the ink is dry, and the great voyages of the past are preserved in the quiet amber of the archives. The smell of damp wool and old paper lingers in the mind, a sensory bridge to a time when the world was measured by the speed of a sailing vessel and the reach of a flickering flame. The lighthouses remain, their foundations rooted in the ancient granite, their lights a testament to the enduring human desire to guide, to protect, and to remember. The sea continues its restless movement, washing over the shoals and the deeps, a timeless presence that has seen the passage of explorers and merchants, keepers and dreamers. In the stillness of the early morning, there is only the sound of the distant surf and the knowledge that, when the sun sets once more, the light will return to its steady, rhythmic vigil.